By the 6th century BCE, the Indian subcontinent was already one of the most politically complex regions in the ancient world. Across the northern plains, from the Indus Basin in the west to the lower Ganges in the east, multiple states had emerged with defined borders, standing armies, urban centers, and systems of taxation. These polities did not exist in isolation. They competed continuously for land, resources, and trade access, creating a political environment marked by rivalry, alliance, and periodic warfare. Ancient Indian textual traditions refer to this landscape as the age of the Mahajanapadas, literally, the Great Territories. Early Buddhist texts such as the Anguttara Nikaya list 16 major states, including Magadha, Kosala, Avanti, Vats, Kuru, Panchala, and Gandhara. While this list is not exhaustive, it reflects a widely recognized political order in northern India between approximately 600 and 350 BCE. These states varied in size and structure, ranging from monarchies ruled by hereditary kings to oligarchic republics governed by assemblies, such as the Vaji Confederation centered at Vaishali. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of this politically fragmented but economically expanding world. Excavations at sites such as Rajgir, Vaishali, Kaushambi, and Taxila reveal fortified settlements, planned streets, craft production areas, and substantial habitation layers dating to the mid-1st millennium BCE. These urban centers functioned as administrative capitals, commercial hubs, and military strongholds. Defensive walls and moats indicate sustained concerns with security, reflecting the frequency of interstate conflict. Geography played a decisive role in shaping this political landscape. The fertile alluvial plains of the Ganges Basin supported intensive wet rice agriculture, which produced food surpluses capable of sustaining large populations and professional armies. Seasonal river systems facilitated transport and communication, allowing states to project power beyond their immediate hinterlands. Control over river crossings, agricultural zones, and trade corridors became central objectives of state policy. Technological developments further accelerated political consolidation. The widespread use of iron tools, beginning around the late 2nd millennium BCE and expanding significantly after 600 BCE, transformed agriculture and warfare. Iron plowshares allowed the clearing of dense forests in the middle Ganges plain, opening new land for cultivation. Iron-tipped weapons and tools improved military effectiveness and construction capabilities. Archaeologists have identified iron artifacts across northern India during this period, particularly in regions associated with Magadha and its rivals. Economic change accompanied these technological shifts. Punch-marked silver coins, among the earliest forms of currency in South Asia, began circulating widely during this era. Numismatic evidence suggests increasing monetization of the economy, particularly in urban and administrative contexts. Taxation in cash, rather than solely in kind, allowed rulers to support standing armies, bureaucratic officials, and infrastructure projects. Market regulation, toll collection, and state monopolies on key resources became common features of governance. Religious and intellectual movements also reflected the changing social order. The emergence of Buddhism and Jainism during this period was closely tied to urbanization and political competition. Early Buddhist and Jain texts describe royal courts, merchant guilds, and urban assemblies, providing indirect evidence of complex social hierarchies and institutional authority. These traditions also document patronage networks that linked rulers, traders, and religious communities across political boundaries. Among the Mahajanapadas, Magadha gradually distinguished itself through a combination of geographic advantage, economic capacity, and administrative innovation. Located in the lower Ganges region, Magadha controlled fertile agricultural land and access to iron deposits in present-day Bihar and Jharkhand. Its capitals, first at Rajgir and later at Pataliputra, were positioned near major river confluences, enhancing communication and trade. Contemporary sources describe Magadhan rulers maintaining large armies and employing systematic revenue collection, setting them apart from many rival states. Conflict between these states was persistent rather than exceptional. Literary sources recount repeated wars between Magadha and neighboring kingdoms such as Kosala and Avanti. Fortifications uncovered at multiple sites indicate long-term preparation for siege and defense. These conflicts did not eliminate political fragmentation, but they did promote administrative experimentation, military organization, and territorial absorption. By the 4th century BCE, northern India had entered a phase in which large-scale political unification had become structurally possible. The institutions required for empire tax systems, standing armies, urban administration, and ideological legitimacy were already in place. What had not yet emerged was a ruling power capable of integrating these elements across the entire subcontinent. As regional power increasingly concentrated in Magadha, the balance between fragmented polities and centralized authority began to shift, setting the conditions for a new form of kingship and governance to develop. Magadha's power did not rest on conquest alone, but on durable systems of governance. By the 5th century BCE, this kingdom had begun to distinguish itself from other Mahajanapadas through a combination of administrative organization, geographic advantage, and sustained military capacity. While contemporary sources preserve limited narrative detail, archaeological and textual evidence together indicate a steady process of institutional consolidation rather than abrupt political transformation. The early expansion of Magadha is traditionally associated with the Haryanka dynasty, whose rulers governed from approximately the 6th to the 5th century BCE. Buddhist texts, including passages in the Pali Canon, reference kings such as Bimbisara and Ajatashatru, not as legendary figures, but as active participants in regional diplomacy, warfare, and religious patronage. These accounts describe alliances through marriage, territorial conflicts with neighboring states such as Kosala and the Vaji Confederation, and the maintenance of fortified capitals. While the literary sources emphasize royal personalities, the underlying continuity lies in the administrative systems these rulers sustained. Archaeological evidence from Rajgir, identified with the ancient capital Jarivarja, supports descriptions of an early fortified center. Stone walls, earthworks, and settlement remains indicate long-term occupation and planned defense. Rajgir's location within a ring of hills provided natural fortification, while nearby agricultural land supported population growth. These features suggest a state already capable of coordinating labor, resource extraction, and military defense on a regional scale. During the later Shishanaga dynasty, Magadha's political center shifted from Rajgir to Pataliputra, near the confluence of the Ganges, Sun, and Gandak rivers. This relocation marked a significant administrative development. Pataliputra's position enabled control over riverine transport routes that linked eastern India with the central Gangetic plain. Archaeologists have uncovered structural remains at Kumar, including pillar bases and wooden architecture, indicating large administrative or ceremonial buildings dating to the early historic period. These findings align with textual descriptions of Pataliputra as a major political and economic hub. The movement of the capital did not represent a break with earlier institutions but an expansion of their scale. Administrative authority remained centralized under the king, supported by officials responsible for taxation, justice, and military organization. Early forms of revenue collection are referenced in Buddhist sources, which describe land taxes and levies imposed on agricultural produce. Such systems required regular assessment and record-keeping, indicating the presence of trained administrators and standardized procedures. Control of natural resources further reinforced Magadha's position. The kingdom's proximity to iron deposits in regions such as southern Bihar and eastern India allowed sustained production of weapons and tools. Archaeological surveys have documented iron smelting sites and artifact distribution consistent with centralized demand. This access to iron strengthened both agricultural productivity and military effectiveness, providing Magadha with advantages over rival states less well supplied with raw materials. Military organization also reflected institutional continuity. Literary references describe standing armies composed of infantry, cavalry, chariots, and war elephants. Although these accounts lack precise figures, they consistently emphasize Magadha's capacity to mobilize forces larger than those of neighboring polities. The maintenance of such armies required stable revenue streams, supply chains, and administrative oversight, reinforcing the relationship between economic management and military power. Magadha's governance extended beyond coercion. The kingdom maintained diplomatic relations and patronage networks with religious communities, particularly Buddhist and Jain groups. Monasteries and teachers received support from royal courts, while rulers gained legitimacy through association with respected moral traditions. These interactions, recorded in early religious texts, illustrate a political environment in which authority was reinforced through institutional and ideological means rather than solely through force. By the 4th century BCE, Magadha had absorbed or subordinated several rival states, including parts of Kosala and the Vaji territory. This expansion was not uniformly achieved through direct annexation, but through a combination of military pressure, administrative integration, and strategic alliance. The persistence of Magadhan authority across successive dynasties indicates that its power derived from systems capable of outlasting individual rulers. As Magadha's administrative capacity expanded and its institutions matured, the kingdom developed a framework of governance that extended well beyond the scale of earlier Mahajanapadas. This inheritance of centralized authority, resource control, and bureaucratic coordination would soon be seized and expanded by a new ruling house, transforming regional dominance into imperial rule. Before the Mauryas ruled India, an empire already existed in structure, if not stability. In the late 4th century BCE, the Nanda dynasty governed a realm that extended across much of northern India, representing the most centralized and resource-rich state the subcontinent had yet produced. Although their rule was brief, lasting roughly from 345 to 322 BCE, the institutional framework they constructed would directly shape the Mauryan Empire that followed. The Nandas emerged from within the political environment established by Magadha's earlier dynasties. Indian literary traditions, including later Buddhist and Brahmanical sources, portray the Nandas as rulers who displaced the Shishanaga line, consolidating power rapidly and decisively. While these accounts often emphasize social resentment toward the dynasty, they also consistently describe a state of unprecedented wealth, administrative reach, and military capacity. These descriptions are supported by external testimony from Greek historians writing after Alexander the Great's campaigns in northwestern India. Greek authors such as Diodorus Siculus and Quintus Curtius Rufus provide detailed, though second-hand, descriptions of the Nanda kingdom. They record that the Nandas possessed vast financial reserves and commanded a standing army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, including infantry, cavalry, chariots, and war elephants. While modern historians treat these figures cautiously, the consistency of such reports suggests that the Nanda state maintained a military establishment significantly larger than those of earlier Mahajanapadas. This scale implies a high degree of fiscal organization and administrative coordination. Revenue extraction formed the foundation of Nanda power. Indian traditions describe heavy taxation, particularly on agricultural output, trade, and artisanal production. These accounts indicate standardized revenue systems rather than ad hoc exactions. The ability to collect taxes across diverse regions required trained officials, reliable record-keeping, and mechanisms of enforcement. Although direct administrative documents from the Nanda period have not survived, the continuity of fiscal practices into the Mauryan era suggests that such systems were already firmly in place. The Nandas ruled from Pataliputra, which had become the administrative and logistical center of northern India. Archaeological remains at sites such as Kumar reveal large-scale construction, including pillared halls and wooden structures consistent with royal or administrative use. These findings align with textual descriptions of Pataliputra as a fortified city capable of supporting a large population and a complex bureaucracy. Control of riverine transport along the Ganges and its tributaries allowed the Nandas to move troops, goods, and officials efficiently across their territory. Centralization under the Nandas extended beyond fiscal matters. The dynasty appears to have reduced the autonomy of regional elites, concentrating authority at the royal court. This approach increased administrative efficiency but also generated political opposition. Later Indian sources emphasize the unpopularity of the Nanda rulers, describing them as harsh tax collectors and socially distant from traditional elites. While these portrayals may reflect retrospective moral judgments, they nonetheless point to tensions inherent in rapid centralization. The Nanda military apparatus further illustrates the scale of their state. Greek accounts emphasize the deterrent effect of the Nanda army, noting that Alexander's troops reportedly refused to advance deeper into India after learning of its size. Regardless of the precise historical circumstances, this tradition reflects a widely recognized perception of Nanda military strength. Maintaining such forces required not only manpower but also sustained provisioning, training, and command structures. Despite these achievements, the Nanda regime lacked long-term political stability. Succession disputes, elite resistance, and public dissatisfaction weakened the dynasty's hold on power. Indian traditions consistently depict the fall of the Nandas as rapid, suggesting that centralized authority had outpaced the development of durable political legitimacy. This imbalance left the state vulnerable to internal overthrow rather than external invasion. When the Nanda dynasty collapsed around 322 BCE, its institutions did not disappear. Administrative systems, revenue mechanisms, military organization, and the centralized capital at Pataliputra all remained intact. These structures would be inherited by Chandragupta Maurya and his advisors, providing the material foundation for a new imperial regime. At the same time, popular resentment toward Nanda rule shaped the strategies of the Mauryas, who sought broader legitimacy through alliance building and ideological support. This fragile concentration of power, highly centralized yet politically unstable, set the stage for revolutionary leadership that would transform inherited institutions into a more enduring imperial system. Imperial transitions often occur not through collapse, but through calculated replacement. In northern India, around 322 BCE, Chandragupta Maurya emerged as a unifying figure capable of transforming the centralized yet unstable Nanda state into a durable empire. Sources describing his rise include Buddhist chronicles, Jain traditions, and Greek accounts, each offering different perspectives. While some of these accounts contain legendary elements, careful analysis allows a historically plausible reconstruction of the political environment and strategic decisions that facilitated Chandragupta's ascent. Buddhist texts, including the Mahavamsa and Dipavamsa, record Chandragupta's connection to the Nanda dynasty through the displacement of the last Nanda ruler, Brihadratha. These accounts describe the assistance of Chanakya, a Brahmin scholar and political strategist, who guided Chandragupta in both military and administrative planning. Jain sources, such as the Parashishtaparvan, similarly emphasize strategic planning and alliances, presenting a consistent image of an emerging leader operating within a structured political framework rather than relying solely on personal heroism. Greek accounts, notably those of Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, provide external confirmation of a powerful kingdom in northern India and describe interactions with the Hellenistic world, which contextualize Chandragupta's rise within broader geopolitical currents. Chandragupta capitalized on several structural factors that favored a transfer of power. The Nanda dynasty, despite its wealth and administrative reach, was unpopular among regional elites and common populations due to heavy taxation and centralization of authority. Internal discontent weakened local loyalties, allowing an organized and strategically positioned challenger to exploit existing fractures. Simultaneously, prolonged conflicts among neighboring Mahajanapadas had created military fatigue, which limited coordinated resistance to an ambitious claimant emerging from the Magadhan heartland. Military organization was central to Chandragupta's strategy. Although detailed records of troop numbers are scarce, Greek and Indian sources indicate that he controlled forces sufficient to secure Pataliputra and subdue rival regions. The recruitment of local militias, consolidation of standing troops inherited from the Nandas, and the application of strategic alliances enabled Chandragupta to project power rapidly across northern India. Campaigns focused initially on neighboring Mahajanapadas such as Avanti and Kosala, where the combination of military pressure and negotiation facilitated the gradual absorption of territories into his domain. Chanakya's role in this process involved both administrative and diplomatic coordination. Textual evidence from the Arthashastra, while composed after Chandragupta's rise, reflects principles consistent with practices employed during this period, including intelligence gathering, targeted coercion, and the use of strategic alliances to isolate rivals. Chanakya's guidance appears to have emphasized systemic consolidation over reliance on personal charisma, ensuring that newly acquired territories were integrated under standardized administrative procedures. Economic and geographic factors also supported Chandragupta's emergence. Control of the lower Ganges plain provided access to fertile agricultural land and riverine trade routes, ensuring stable revenue streams for military campaigns and governance. Pataliputra's strategic location near the confluence of major rivers facilitated both logistical coordination and the movement of troops, while proximity to iron deposits ensured a reliable supply of weapons and tools. These resources reinforced the viability of long-term centralized control. Diplomatic engagement supplemented military conquest. Greek sources note that Chandragupta later negotiated with Seleucus I Nicator, reflecting an early recognition of the importance of external relations. While this diplomatic episode occurred after his initial rise, it indicates that even during the early consolidation of power, Chandragupta's administration maintained awareness of broader regional dynamics, including the presence of Hellenistic successors in northwest India following Alexander's withdrawal. By the time Chandragupta had established himself as ruler of Magadha, the political map of northern India had been substantially altered. Key urban centers, fortified sites, and strategic riverine corridors were under centralized control. Administrative institutions inherited from the Nandas were adapted and expanded to accommodate the growing territorial extent. Revenue collection, military organization, and provincial oversight were systematized to ensure both efficiency and resilience. The result was a state capable of sustained governance, rather than a temporary coalition based on personal leadership alone. With internal authority secured, Chandragupta faced external pressures that would soon test the limits of his administration. Neighboring territories retained residual autonomy, and emerging Hellenistic powers in the northwest represented potential strategic threats. The foundations laid during Chandragupta's rise, however, provided the organizational and economic capacity to address these challenges, enabling the Mauryan state to transition from regional dominance to a framework capable of imperial expansion. India's first empire entered global politics through negotiation, not annihilation. By the early 3rd century BCE, Chandragupta Maurya had consolidated authority across northern India, but the western frontier remained in flux. Alexander the Great's campaigns, which concluded in 323 BCE, had left a series of Hellenistic successor states across modern Afghanistan, Baluchistan, and parts of the Indus Valley. Among these, Seleucus I Nicator, ruler of the Seleucid Empire, sought to extend influence eastward. The resulting interactions between Chandragupta and Seleucus constitute the earliest sustained political and diplomatic contact between an Indian imperial power and the Hellenistic world. Greek sources, including accounts preserved by Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, and later summaries of Megasthenes, provide contextual evidence for the conflict and its resolution. According to these records, Chandragupta initially secured territories west of the Indus, establishing authority in regions corresponding to modern eastern Afghanistan and southern Baluchistan. Seleucus, seeking to stabilize his eastern provinces and avoid protracted warfare, entered into negotiations with Chandragupta around 305 BCE. The resulting settlement involved a territorial exchange, with Seleucus retaining strategic holdings to the west while recognizing Mauryan control over contested regions. The agreement was reinforced through a diplomatic marriage alliance, which Greek sources describe as a union between Seleucus' family and Chandragupta's. While the precise details of the alliance remain debated, the arrangement illustrates the use of formalized diplomatic mechanisms to secure imperial boundaries and establish mutual recognition. This approach avoided large-scale military confrontation, indicating that the Mauryan leadership prioritized sustainable territorial administration over purely coercive expansion. Mauryan control extended into key urban and resource centers in the northwest, facilitating trade and administrative reach. Cities such as Taxila became focal points for governance, connecting riverine transport networks with overland trade routes leading into Central Asia. Archaeological evidence, including coinage circulation and fortified settlements, confirms the integration of these regions into a broader administrative framework. Greek observations of Magadhan ambassadors in these cities, as recorded by Megasthenes, corroborate the presence of institutional authority beyond the core Ganges plains. The military balance between the Mauryas and the Seleucid forces also contributed to the negotiated outcome. Greek sources suggest that Chandragupta commanded a formidable army, including war elephants, infantry, and cavalry capable of rapid deployment across the Indus frontier. Seleucus, recognizing the logistical challenges of extended campaigns in unfamiliar terrain, opted for a diplomatic settlement that ensured security and access to trade without risking protracted conflict. This outcome demonstrates the Maurya Empire's capacity to project power efficiently across long distances, combining both military preparedness and strategic negotiation. Economic considerations reinforced the settlement. Control over western regions secured access to trade corridors connecting India with the Hellenistic world, facilitating exchange of commodities such as textiles, spices, and metals. Revenue from these regions contributed to the empire's capacity to maintain standing armies, administrative offices, and infrastructure projects. These gains extended Mauryan influence while integrating previously peripheral regions into the political and economic structures of the state. The resolution of the conflict also established enduring precedents for Mauryan diplomacy. Ambassadors and envoys, including Greek representatives such as Megasthenes, were stationed at Pataliputra, providing formal channels for communication and observation. Megasthenes' later accounts described the administrative organization, urban centers, and political structures of the Mauryan state, indicating that these diplomatic engagements facilitated knowledge transfer and cross-cultural awareness. Such mechanisms supported both internal governance and external legitimacy. Following the settlement, Chandragupta's Western acquisitions required administrative integration. Provincial governors, often drawn from trusted officials, were tasked with overseeing revenue collection, law enforcement, and military preparedness. The integration of diverse populations, including Greek, Persian, and local Indian communities, necessitated standardized procedures for governance while accommodating regional variations. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Taxila and the surrounding valleys indicates the construction of fortified administrative centers, consistent with the establishment of effective imperial oversight. By the end of these negotiations, the Maurya Empire had established control over a contiguous territory from the Ganges Plains to the western frontiers of modern Afghanistan and Baluchistan. This marked the first time an Indian polity maintained sustained political, military, and administrative engagement with Hellenistic states. The settlement also enhanced the empire's capacity to coordinate resources across distant regions, setting a precedent for the organizational complexity that would characterize later Mauryan administration under Chandragupta and his successor. With internal authority consolidated and western boundaries stabilized through diplomacy, the Mauryan state was positioned to focus on both institutional expansion and economic integration. These territorial gains required unprecedented administrative coordination, encompassing revenue collection, troop deployment, and communication across diverse regions. The systems established during this period would provide the structural foundation for the empire's subsequent consolidation under Chandragupta and eventual transition to Ashokan governance. Empire endured not by conquest alone, but by organization. Following the consolidation of northern India and the western territories, Chandragupta Maurya established a centralized system of governance capable of sustaining control across a vast and diverse domain. Textual sources, most notably the Arthashastra, provide detailed prescriptions for administration, provincial oversight, taxation, urban management, and intelligence gathering. While these writings reflect idealized models, archaeological evidence from Pataliputra and surrounding regions confirms the practical implementation of complex bureaucratic structures during Chandragupta's reign. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by appointed officials responsible for law, revenue, and military readiness. Greek sources, including Megasthenes, describe administrative centers staffed by officials who supervised local taxation, trade regulation, and public works. Archaeological excavations at Kumar in Pataliputra reveal the remains of large pillared halls and fortified enclosures, suggesting centralized coordination of bureaucratic functions. These sites correspond to descriptions of administrative and ceremonial buildings, indicating that governance relied on permanent infrastructure rather than ad hoc arrangements. Revenue collection formed the foundation of state capacity. Land taxes, levies on urban markets, and duties on trade provided a stable fiscal base to maintain armies, infrastructure, and administrative personnel. Buddhist and Jain sources note the systematic collection of revenue, emphasizing the presence of trained officials capable of assessing production and enforcing compliance. Standardized weights and measures, attested in archaeological finds and coinage, facilitated both taxation and commerce, ensuring predictable flows of resources to the imperial center. Military organization was integrated with administrative oversight. Provincial governors were responsible for raising and maintaining local contingents, while the central authority coordinated strategic deployments. The combination of standing forces, locally levied troops, and regional levies allowed Chandragupta to secure newly acquired territories efficiently. Greek accounts confirm the use of war elephants, cavalry, and infantry units in both defensive and offensive operations, illustrating the interdependence of military readiness and administrative control. Urban management constituted a further dimension of governance. Cities such as Pataliputra and Taxila functioned as administrative, economic, and logistical hubs. Archaeological evidence indicates planned streets, fortifications, and public buildings consistent with systematic urban planning. Officials oversaw food supply, market regulation, sanitation, and law enforcement, supporting dense populations and facilitating the mobilization of resources for imperial projects. The integration of these urban centers into the broader provincial framework reflects the Mauryan emphasis on organized governance rather than reliance on personal rule. Intelligence and surveillance were integral components of administrative practice. The Arthashastra details the deployment of spies, informants, and inspectors to monitor provincial officials, trade activities, and potential sources of dissent. While these descriptions are prescriptive, their inclusion in multiple textual traditions suggests that mechanisms for oversight and information gathering were operational. Control over intelligence networks allowed the central authority to anticipate challenges, enforce policy, and maintain cohesion across a geographically extensive empire. The administrative system also incorporated legal and judicial functions. Governors and local officials adjudicated civil and criminal matters under royal oversight. Textual sources describe structured courts, codified penalties, and procedures for appeal, reflecting an effort to standardize governance and reduce arbitrariness. Combined with tax collection, military organization, and intelligence operations, the judicial system contributed to the durability and predictability of imperial authority. Coordination across the empire relied on communication networks linking the capital with provincial centers. Riverine transport along the Ganges and its tributaries facilitated the movement of personnel, goods, and messages, while roads and way stations supported overland travel. These networks enabled timely administrative responses, rapid mobilization of troops, and consistent enforcement of policy throughout the territories under Mauryan control. Archaeological surveys confirm the presence of infrastructure consistent with such coordination, including fortified river crossings and embankments. While the Arthashastra reflects normative ideals, evidence from both textual and material sources indicates that Chandragupta's administration implemented many of its principles in practical form. Provinces were systematically supervised, taxation was regularized, urban centers were managed with oversight, and military forces were integrated with civil governance. Together, these structures established a centralized state capable of maintaining authority over a heterogeneous population and extensive territory, providing the foundation for the empire's later expansion and consolidation. By the end of Chandragupta's reign, the Mauryan administrative system had achieved functional coherence. Provincial management, fiscal infrastructure, intelligence networks, urban oversight, and military coordination formed an integrated framework that ensured both efficiency and resilience. These systems would reach full maturity under Chandragupta's successor, providing the organizational basis for the empire's expansion, stability, and long-term governance. Empires often stabilize quietly between moments of transformation. Following Chandragupta Maurya's establishment of the First Pan-Indian Empire, his successor, Bindusara, ruled from approximately 297 to 273 BCE. Unlike the dramatic rise of his father, Bindusara's tenure is characterized by consolidation, administrative maintenance, and cautious territorial management. The period reflects a strategic focus on internal cohesion and regional stability, rather than aggressive expansion, providing the structural foundation for the ideological and administrative innovations that would emerge under Ashoka. Bindusara inherited a complex imperial apparatus spanning the Gangetic Plains, the western frontier acquired from the Seleucids, and the sub-Himalayan regions of northern India. Archaeological evidence from Pataliputra, including continued fortification efforts and urban infrastructure development, indicates sustained investment in central administrative functions. These constructions suggest that Bindusara prioritized the maintenance of communication networks, market regulation, and troop mobilization, ensuring the efficient functioning of a state with extensive territorial responsibilities. Literary sources regarding Bindusara are comparatively sparse. Buddhist chronicles and Jain traditions offer limited commentary on his policies or personal activities, focusing instead on genealogical succession. Greek sources, notably those referencing diplomatic contact with the Hellenistic world, provide supplementary information. Accounts suggest that Bindusara received emissaries from Greek rulers and maintained communication channels with Seleucid authorities, reflecting continuity in foreign relations established under Chandragupta. These interactions primarily concerned frontier management, trade, and the recognition of territorial boundaries rather than military engagement. One area frequently cited in later traditions is Bindusara's southern policy. Sources attribute the expansion into parts of present-day Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra Pradesh, though archaeological evidence for systematic annexation during this period remains limited. Inscriptions and regional urban layers show limited Mauryan presence in the Deccan Plateau, primarily at trade hubs and administrative outposts, suggesting that southern influence was exercised indirectly rather than through full political integration. Military deployment appears focused on securing supply lines, maintaining garrisons, and safeguarding communication corridors, rather than launching sustained campaigns of conquest. Revenue administration and bureaucratic oversight continued without interruption. Provincial governors, often drawn from trusted officials within the imperial hierarchy, maintained control over urban centers, agricultural zones, and trade nodes. Textual references, including summaries of the Arthashastra, indicate the persistence of standardized taxation systems, record-keeping practices, and provincial supervision. These mechanisms ensured continuity of fiscal flows, allowing Bindusara to maintain both standing forces and administrative personnel throughout his dominion. The military apparatus under Bindusara also reflects a focus on stability. Greek accounts note that the Mauryan army remained formidable, including infantry, cavalry, war elephants, and strategic reserves positioned along key riverine routes and fortified cities. Unlike Chandragupta's campaigns, there is little evidence of extensive offensive operations during Bindusara's reign. Instead, troop deployment appears designed to deter rebellion, protect economic assets, and secure borders inherited from prior expansions. The integration of military readiness with civil administration indicates sustained reliance on centralized coordination for long-term governance. Urban centers retained their significance as administrative and economic hubs. Excavations at Pataliputra and other provincial cities reveal continued construction of administrative complexes, storage facilities, and fortified perimeters. Trade regulation, market oversight, and the provision of supplies for both urban populations and garrison troops demonstrate the Mauryan emphasis on organized urban management. Riverine transport along the Ganges and tributary networks ensured connectivity, supporting both revenue collection and rapid communication between provincial authorities and the imperial capital. Foreign diplomacy also remained a component of Bindusara's governance. Greek sources, including the writings of Megasthenes, suggest ongoing awareness of regional Hellenistic powers. While direct military confrontation with Seleucid territories did not occur, the maintenance of diplomatic channels facilitated political recognition and commercial exchange. These engagements reflect continuity with Chandragupta's strategy of combining strategic negotiation with territorial security, reinforcing the Mauryan model of empire as both administrative and diplomatic in nature. Bindusara's reign illustrates the consolidation phase typical of early empires. Political integration across culturally and linguistically diverse regions required consistent application of administrative protocols, fiscal oversight, and military supervision. The absence of major recorded revolts or widespread fragmentation suggests that these mechanisms were effective, preserving the cohesion of the empire across more than 1,000 kilometers of territory. Archaeological and textual evidence together support a view of Bindusara as a ruler focused on sustaining inherited structures rather than initiating dramatic innovation. The stability achieved during this period set conditions for subsequent ideological developments. With borders secured, revenue streams standardized, and military forces positioned to enforce compliance, the Mauryan state possessed the capacity to implement new policies and propagate centralized principles of governance. This consolidation phase allowed later rulers, particularly Ashoka, to introduce moral and administrative reforms on a subcontinental scale, confident that the institutional foundation could support these innovations. By the end of Bindusara's reign, the Mauryan Empire had matured into a durable political entity. Administrative continuity, fiscal stability, military preparedness, and diplomatic engagement ensured that the empire could absorb internal challenges and external pressures without significant disruption. These conditions not only preserved Chandragupta's achievements but also established the operational framework necessary for the transformative policies that would define the next phase of Mauryan governance. Succession determined not only rulers, but the moral direction of empire. During Bindusara's reign, the Mauryan court was both a center of administration and a site of elite negotiation, factionalism, and strategic planning. While the emperor maintained overall authority, regional governors, military commanders, and bureaucrats exercised influence in ways that shaped political outcomes. Understanding the court dynamics of this period requires careful evaluation of Buddhist, Jain, and classical sources, which provide complementary but sometimes contrasting perspectives on elite politics, succession rivalries, and the emergence of Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka. Buddhist chronicles, including the Mahavamsa and the Dipavamsa, emphasize the moral and dynastic dimensions of court life. These texts describe Bindusara as a ruler whose authority was both inherited and maintained through ceremonial and administrative structures. They also provide narratives of court intrigue, particularly regarding succession disputes. Buddhist accounts detail rival factions supporting different heirs, reflecting the interplay between senior ministers, provincial governors, and members of the royal family. While these narratives often imbue events with moral or ethical framing, they preserve valuable information regarding the presence of structured elite networks and mechanisms of influence. Jain sources, such as the Parashishtaparvan, offer parallel insights. They describe Bindusara's court as a hub of political deliberation, where advisors, military officials, and royal relatives engaged in negotiation and power balancing. These accounts highlight the procedural and institutional frameworks through which succession claims were advanced, illustrating that royal inheritance was shaped by both legal precedent and practical negotiation. While some details are hagiographic, the consistency across sources supports the historical plausibility of factionalized court politics. The emergence of Ashoka as the eventual successor occurred within this context of court rivalry. Buddhist texts emphasize his early exposure to governance, military affairs, and imperial administration. They describe a period of intradynastic competition, in which Ashoka's position as a younger son required both strategic alliances and the support of key officials. These accounts indicate that succession was not a simple matter of primogeniture but was mediated by political calculation, ministerial influence, and regional loyalties. Jain sources corroborate the existence of succession disputes, though they provide fewer narrative details regarding individual protagonists. Court culture during this period extended beyond succession politics. Royal assemblies served as centers for decision-making on taxation, military deployment, infrastructure, and diplomatic relations. Textual references describe regular consultation with senior officials, including provincial governors and military commanders, illustrating a continuity of administrative practice inherited from Chandragupta and Bindusara's consolidation of authority. This structured governance ensured that, despite internal rivalries, the empire could maintain fiscal stability, military readiness, and provincial oversight. Elite rivalry often revolved around control of key urban and military centers. Pataliputra remained the focal point of administrative coordination, while regional capitals such as Taxila and Ujjain served as nodes of both authority and influence. Control over these cities conferred leverage in succession negotiations, as access to fiscal resources, military personnel, and logistical networks enabled factions to assert political weight. Archaeological evidence from these urban centers demonstrates continued fortification, infrastructural development, and administrative activity, reflecting the practical basis of courtly power. Military and bureaucratic networks played a central role in succession dynamics. Commanders and provincial officials could align with claimants to influence outcomes, providing forces or administrative support. Greek accounts and later Indian texts suggest that military loyalty was instrumental in resolving disputes, indicating that control over standing troops and strategic garrisons was both a political and administrative necessity. This integration of military and bureaucratic authority illustrates the systemic nature of Mauryan governance, which could accommodate factional contestation without destabilizing the empire. Diplomatic considerations also influenced court behavior. The Mauryan Empire maintained relations with Hellenistic states and internal polities, requiring coherent policy even during periods of dynastic uncertainty. Envoys, correspondence, and formal delegations facilitated continuity in governance and trade, ensuring that external actors could rely on the state despite internal succession disputes. Megasthenes' accounts, though composed slightly later, reflect an awareness of the empire's bureaucratic consistency and its capacity to function effectively even amid elite negotiation. Religious and moral authority intersected with succession politics. Buddhist sources suggest that moral reputation, ethical behavior, and patronage of religious institutions were factors that shaped perceptions of legitimacy. Ashoka's later engagement with Buddhism and the propagation of dharmic governance can be traced to the environment in which succession required both political acumen and moral positioning. Jain texts similarly note the role of religious advisors in mediating disputes, indicating that ideological influence was integrated into the courtly decision-making framework. Despite these tensions, administrative continuity was maintained. Revenue collection, provincial oversight, urban management, and military coordination persisted without significant interruption. Buddhist and Jain sources describe the central authority's capacity to enforce policy and maintain cohesion, suggesting that systemic governance structures were resilient to elite rivalries. Archaeological evidence corroborates this continuity, with construction, fortification, and urban planning projects continuing steadily during the late Bindusara period. The resolution of succession disputes ultimately enabled Ashoka to ascend the throne, marking a pivotal transition in Mauryan history. The consolidation of authority under a single ruler with established bureaucratic support allowed for both political stability and the later implementation of ideological reforms. Ashoka's accession was not a sudden rupture but the outcome of structured negotiation, administrative continuity, and strategic alignment of elite networks. The processes that facilitated his rise exemplify how court culture and succession dynamics can shape the operational and moral trajectory of an empire. By the conclusion of this period, the Mauryan state had maintained cohesion across diverse regions, managed elite rivalries, and prepared the institutional framework for Ashoka's transformative policies. Administrative continuity, military coordination, urban oversight, and diplomatic engagement ensured that the empire could absorb internal contestation without compromising stability. This structural resilience set the stage for a redefinition of Mauryan rule under Ashoka, both in territorial management and ideological orientation. Ashoka inherited a complete empire and the burden of its power. Around 268 BCE, he ascended the Mauryan throne following the death of his father, Bindusara. The empire he received extended from the eastern Gangetic plains to the western reaches of modern Afghanistan, incorporating regions consolidated under Chandragupta and stabilized by Bindusara. The administration, military apparatus, and provincial framework were already well established, providing Ashoka with an operational structure capable of supporting both continuity and reform. Textual and epigraphic sources anchor the chronology of Ashoka's accession. Buddhist chronicles, including the Mahavamsa and Dipavamsa, place his coronation shortly after Bindusara's death, highlighting his initial control over key imperial centers such as Pataliputra, Ujjain, and Taxila. These sources describe a ruler emerging within an existing bureaucratic framework, inheriting provincial governors, urban administrators, and a standing military capable of enforcing imperial authority. Jain sources offer complementary accounts of succession, emphasizing the procedural aspects of royal accession and the role of courtly networks in confirming legitimacy. Epigraphic evidence, particularly the inscriptions of Ashoka, provides further context. Early edicts reference the maintenance of administrative systems and the continuity of law and order, reflecting an emphasis on governance rather than mere personal rule. These inscriptions demonstrate that the emperor assumed responsibility for revenue collection, provincial oversight, and military coordination immediately upon accession. The ability to mobilize these structures efficiently underscores the effectiveness of institutional inheritance from Chandragupta and Bindusara. The military apparatus inherited by Ashoka was extensive. Greek and Indian sources indicate the presence of infantry, cavalry, war elephants, and regional contingents under provincial commanders. Troop placement was both strategic and functional, securing frontier regions and maintaining internal stability. The deployment of forces allowed Ashoka to assert control over peripheral territories while ensuring rapid response to rebellions or external threats. This inherited military readiness would soon be tested in campaigns requiring both logistical coordination and strategic execution. Provincial administration provided another pillar of Ashoka's inherited authority. Governors maintained oversight of taxation, law enforcement, urban management, and trade regulation. Archaeological evidence from Pataliputra and regional capitals such as Taxila and Ujjain supports textual accounts of sustained urban infrastructure, fortified administrative complexes, and organized settlement planning. These centers facilitated communication between the imperial court and distant provinces, enabling consistent policy implementation and the management of local disputes. Economic and resource management systems were also already established. Land revenue, trade duties, and agricultural levies generated the financial foundation required to maintain the standing army, administrative apparatus, and public works. Coinage circulation, standardized weights and measures, and riverine transport networks ensured efficient resource distribution. By inheriting these mechanisms, Ashoka assumed control over an empire capable of both internal stability and external projection of power. Diplomatic continuity further reinforced Ashoka's accession. Relations with Hellenistic states persisted, reflecting agreements and communications established under Chandragupta and maintained under Bindusara. Greek sources describe Mauryan envoys and the reception of foreign emissaries, indicating that the empire's external engagements relied on institutionalized channels rather than ad hoc negotiation. These arrangements secured the empire's western frontiers while allowing the central authority to concentrate on internal governance. Despite these inherited strengths, Ashoka faced challenges inherent in any extensive empire. Succession disputes, regional loyalties, and potential unrest required careful oversight. Buddhist and Jain sources reference initial consolidation measures, including strategic appointments of provincial governors, reassessment of frontier defenses, and reinforcement of fiscal procedures. These actions reflect a pragmatic approach to maintaining stability while assuming the responsibilities of imperial power. The inheritance of the Mauryan Empire provided Ashoka with both opportunity and obligation. The existing administrative, military, and fiscal infrastructure allowed for immediate exercise of authority, but it also imposed constraints. Effective governance required adherence to established protocols, maintenance of provincial oversight, and integration of diverse populations across cultural, linguistic, and geographic boundaries. Ashoka's early policies demonstrate the management of these inherited responsibilities, preparing the state for subsequent campaigns and reforms. By the end of this initial phase, Ashoka had established secure control over the core territories of the Mauryan Empire. Administrative systems functioned under centralized oversight, military forces were deployed strategically, and fiscal and urban management mechanisms continued to operate effectively. This period of political inheritance set the stage for the empire's first major military test. The campaign against Kalinga, which would have profound consequences for both territorial consolidation and Ashoka's subsequent ideological transformation. Kalinga marked the last great war of Mauryan expansion. Around 261 BCE, Ashoka launched a campaign against the independent kingdom of Kalinga, situated in the eastern coastal region of present-day Odisha. The conflict represented both a strategic effort to secure the empire's eastern frontier and a test of the Mauryan military and administrative apparatus. Contemporary and later sources, particularly Ashoka's own Rock Edict 13, provide critical evidence for understanding the scale, human impact, and political implications of the campaign. Kalinga had remained outside Mauryan control during Chandragupta and Bindusara's reigns, retaining regional autonomy and trade networks along the Bay of Bengal. Its position at the confluence of riverine and coastal routes made it a strategically significant territory for both economic and security considerations. Archaeological surveys indicate a dense network of settlements, fortified towns, and maritime trade hubs, reflecting a polity capable of organized resistance. These features necessitated a coordinated military response from the Mauryan Central Authority. The campaign was executed using the Mauryan military framework established under Chandragupta and refined by Bindusara. Greek and Indian sources confirm the deployment of infantry, cavalry, and war elephants, organized under provincial commanders accountable to the central authority. The logistics of moving large forces over riverine and coastal terrain required careful planning, including the provision of supplies, coordination of troop movements, and maintenance of communication lines with the imperial capital, Pataliputra. These operations illustrate the Mauryan capacity for projecting power across diverse geographies. Ashoka's Rock Edict 13 provides quantitative and qualitative data regarding the human cost of the conflict. The inscription records the numbers of casualties and deportees, as well as the displacement of civilian populations. These figures, while framed within the context of imperial record-keeping, demonstrate the scale of military engagement and the administrative consequences of war. In particular, the movement of captured populations necessitated the implementation of resettlement policies, labor allocation, and fiscal adjustments to integrate the newly acquired territories into the Mauryan state. The war also tested the empire's administrative and governance structures. Provincial officials were responsible for stabilizing Kalinga after conquest, including the establishment of fiscal systems, law enforcement, and urban management. Fortified settlements and garrison towns facilitated both military control and civil administration. Archaeological evidence indicates continued urban occupation and fortification in coastal centers following Mauryan annexation, suggesting that the integration of Kalinga was achieved through systematic administrative oversight rather than solely through coercion. The political significance of the Kalinga campaign extended beyond territorial annexation. Control of the eastern coast enabled the Mauryan state to consolidate trade networks connecting inland India with maritime routes in the Bay of Bengal. Access to ports facilitated commerce in textiles, metals, and agricultural products, enhancing revenue streams and reinforcing the economic foundation of the empire. Administrative coordination was essential to manage these networks effectively, integrating Kalinga's economy within the larger imperial fiscal and logistic framework. Ashoka's inscriptions indicate a deliberate approach to post-war governance. Rock Edict 13 emphasizes population management, the appointment of officials, and the re-establishment of social and economic order. These measures reflect a practical understanding of the complexities involved in integrating a previously independent polity. Officials were tasked with ensuring compliance with Mauryan legal codes, collecting revenue, and maintaining infrastructure, demonstrating the systematic application of inherited administrative principles in newly conquered regions. The Kalinga campaign also influenced military doctrine and strategic planning. While the war confirmed the effectiveness of large-scale troop deployment and combined arms operations, it highlighted the challenges of extended campaigns in geographically and culturally distinct regions. Subsequent Mauryan military strategy incorporated lessons from the conflict, including the need for garrisoned outposts, logistical reserves, and coordinated provincial oversight to maintain long-term control without overextending central resources. In addition to territorial and administrative consequences, the campaign had implications for imperial communication and record-keeping. Edicts placed throughout the empire provided both directives and historical records, formalizing the narrative of conquest and integration. These inscriptions, engraved on rocks and pillars, served as tools for documenting the outcomes of military operations, outlining administrative responsibilities, and maintaining continuity in governance across newly acquired regions. The Kalinga inscriptions therefore functioned as both practical instruments of statecraft and historical documentation. By the conclusion of the campaign, the Mauryan Empire had effectively incorporated Kalinga into its administrative and economic system. Provincial management, revenue collection, military oversight, and urban administration ensured that the eastern frontier became a stable and productive component of imperial control. These measures exemplify the Mauryan capacity to translate military success into functional governance, integrating distant territories within a centralized framework while maintaining communication and logistical networks. The aftermath of Kalinga reshaped the operational priorities of the empire. The campaign demonstrated the limits of expansion through military conquest alone and underscored the importance of administrative coordination, resource management, and provincial integration. It also established a precedent for systematic recording of military and civil activities, enhancing transparency and continuity in governance. The successful incorporation of Kalinga into the Mauryan state laid the groundwork for subsequent ideological and policy developments, which would be articulated in Ashoka's later edicts and administrative reforms. In conclusion, the Kalinga War was the final major military campaign of Mauryan territorial expansion. Its significance lies not only in the extension of imperial boundaries, but also in the demonstration of coordinated administrative capacity, strategic military planning, and economic integration. These developments provided the structural basis for the ideological and governance transformations that Ashoka would implement in the years following the campaign. State power began to express itself through ethics. Following the Kalinga campaign, Ashoka implemented a series of administrative and ideological reforms grounded in what he termed Dhamma. Inscriptions, including major rock edicts and pillar edicts, provide the primary evidence for understanding these initiatives. These texts demonstrate that Ashoka sought to institutionalize principles of governance that emphasized social welfare, legal oversight, and public instruction, integrating moral and administrative concerns within the operational framework of the empire. The concept of Dhamma, as articulated in Ashoka's edicts, encompassed directives for behavior, social cohesion, and administrative conduct. While interpretations vary, the edicts consistently emphasize equitable treatment of subjects, support for social institutions, and attention to the welfare of both human and non-human populations. Importantly, these inscriptions are not expressions of personal morality alone. They constitute formalized administrative guidance intended to standardize governance across the diverse and extensive Mauryan territories. Ashoka's edicts provide evidence of systematic implementation. Officials, including provincial governors and appointed emissaries, were instructed to observe compliance with Dhamma, mediate disputes, and report on the welfare of local populations. For example, Rock Edict 13 outlines mechanisms for monitoring and correcting misconduct, while Pillar Edicts 1 and 2 describe measures for promoting ethical behavior among both citizens and bureaucrats. These directives reflect a deliberate strategy to integrate moral and administrative responsibilities within the existing imperial hierarchy. The transition toward Dhamma-based governance did not replace prior administrative systems, but supplemented and structured them. Revenue collection, provincial oversight, military coordination, and urban management continued under standardized procedures. Edicts emphasized that officials should maintain infrastructure, facilitate trade, and ensure law enforcement, while simultaneously promoting ethical conduct. In this manner, moral principles became operationalized, influencing the practical execution of governance rather than serving solely as aspirational rhetoric. Public communication was central to this strategy. Edicts were inscribed on rocks and pillars throughout the empire, in multiple languages and scripts, including Prakrit, Greek, and Aramaic in Western regions. This ensured that directives reached a wide audience, from urban administrators to local populations, reinforcing compliance and awareness of imperial expectations. Archaeological evidence confirms the placement of edicts at strategic locations such as Pataliputra, Dali, and Girnar, reflecting a calculated approach to visibility and administrative penetration. The ideological reform also addressed social institutions and welfare mechanisms. Ashoka's edicts reference support for medical care, infrastructure maintenance, and education, indicating an expanded conception of state responsibility. Officials were tasked with ensuring access to essential services, mediating disputes, and supervising community practices. By formalizing these responsibilities, the administration extended its reach into aspects of daily life that complemented traditional fiscal and military oversight, demonstrating an integrated approach to governance. Religious and cultural pluralism is also apparent in Ashoka's directives. Edicts acknowledge multiple sects and encourage mutual respect among communities, while avoiding the imposition of a single religious framework. This policy reflects an administrative recognition of the empire's diversity and the need for standardized yet flexible governance mechanisms. The emphasis on tolerance and ethical behavior facilitated the consolidation of authority across culturally distinct regions, including the former Kalinga territories and western provinces formerly interacting with Hellenistic states. The transition toward moral governance had operational implications for provincial administration. Governors were responsible for supervising adherence to Dhamma, ensuring equitable application of law, and reporting to the imperial center. Military units and civil officials alike were integrated into this system of oversight, combining administrative, logistical, and ethical duties. This approach reflects an extension of Chandragupta and Bindusara's institutional frameworks, adapted to accommodate Ashoka's ideological objectives without undermining the structural integrity of the state. Communication, monitoring, and record-keeping were formalized as part of the implementation of Dhamma. Edicts describe mechanisms for inspections, reports, and corrective action, indicating that the central authority maintains systematic awareness of provincial conditions. These measures demonstrate that Ashoka's reforms were not purely rhetorical. They relied on the existing bureaucratic and military infrastructure, augmented to incorporate moral and social considerations into operational governance. By the end of this transitional phase, Ashoka had established a model of governance in which ethical principles informed administrative practice, military oversight, fiscal management, and social welfare. This integration transformed imperial authority from a framework based solely on coercive power to one in which state structures codified responsibilities toward subjects and local institutions. While the practical efficacy of these measures varied across regions, the formalized approach reflects a deliberate strategy to align moral, social, and administrative objectives. The consolidation of Dhamma within imperial administration prepared the Mauryan state for sustained internal cohesion and legitimacy across diverse populations. Provincial governance, revenue collection, urban management, and military organization continued to operate efficiently, now supplemented by standardized ethical directives. This framework established a precedent for state responsibility that would influence subsequent policies and administrative practice throughout the empire. State power began to express itself through ethics. Following the Kalinga campaign, Ashoka undertook a significant reorientation of imperial policy, emphasizing what he called Dhamma as a guiding principle of governance. Far from an abstract moral project, Dhamma was articulated in a series of inscriptions distributed across the empire, providing explicit directives for officials and the population. These texts indicate that Ashoka sought to integrate social welfare, legal oversight, and administrative conduct into a unified system of governance, using ethical precepts as operational tools to maintain cohesion and stability. The edicts themselves, major rock edicts, minor rock edicts, and pillar edicts, serve as primary evidence for understanding the structure and intent of this moral administrative framework. They were inscribed at strategic locations across the empire, including urban centers, frontier regions, and trade hubs. The distribution suggests a deliberate strategy to communicate the principles of Dhamma to both the bureaucratic apparatus and the general population, ensuring awareness, compliance, and administrative consistency. Multiple languages and scripts, including Prakrit, Greek, and Aramaic, facilitated access across diverse linguistic and cultural regions. Dhamma encompassed directives for ethical conduct, social order, and governance, emphasizing equitable treatment of subjects, nonviolence in social administration, and the promotion of social welfare. Officials were instructed to monitor local communities, mediate disputes, and report on conditions to the central authority. This system of oversight extended existing administrative hierarchies, incorporating moral responsibilities into standard bureaucratic functions. The edicts specify that provincial governors, district officers, and other officials were accountable for the welfare of both human and non-human populations, illustrating a functional integration of ethics with administrative practice. The approach to governance remained systematic and operational. Existing administrative mechanisms for taxation, urban management, and provincial oversight continued to function under the newly articulated framework of Dhamma. For instance, Officials retained responsibility for land revenue collection and trade regulation, while also ensuring that subjects were treated fairly and that social norms were maintained. In this manner, ethical directives became embedded within practical governance rather than existing as a purely symbolic or aspirational layer. Ashoka's inscriptions also emphasized the dissemination of information and enforcement of Dhamma. Edicts instructed the placement of messages in public spaces, the use of emissaries to communicate directives to local officials, and the collection of reports regarding compliance. This monitoring system relied on the pre-existing bureaucratic and military structures of the Mauryan state, illustrating the adaptation of inherited institutions to support ethical governance. Urban centers such as Pataliputra, Taxila, and Dali served as focal points for implementation and oversight, facilitating communication between the imperial center and regional authorities. The ideology of Dhamma had tangible implications for social and economic policy. Ashoka's edicts described the establishment and maintenance of medical facilities, roads, and public infrastructure, as well as the provision of resources to support social and religious institutions. These measures demonstrate a conceptual expansion of state responsibilities beyond revenue extraction and military enforcement, incorporating systematic attention to welfare and administrative order. Officials were expected to oversee these activities, ensuring that central directives were applied effectively at the local level. Religious and cultural pluralism was a significant aspect of this approach. Ashoka's edicts encourage respect for multiple religious communities, discouraging sectarian conflict and promoting tolerance. This policy reflects an administrative understanding of the empire's cultural diversity and the need to harmonize governance across heterogeneous populations. By codifying ethical standards applicable to both officials and citizens, Ashoka integrated moral guidance with practical administration, reinforcing both legitimacy and cohesion. Military and provincial administration continued under this ethical framework. Governors, military commanders, and other officials were required to maintain security, enforce laws, and manage resources, all while adhering to the principles of Dhamma. Surveillance, reporting, and corrective measures were institutionalized to ensure compliance. This integration of ethics and bureaucracy illustrates the Mauryan capacity to adapt existing governance structures to incorporate ideological objectives, maintaining functionality while reshaping the moral orientation of the state. By the conclusion of this transitional phase, the Mauryan Empire had incorporated ethical governance into operational practice. Dhamma influenced provincial administration, military oversight, urban management, and social welfare systems, providing a consistent framework for state action. This approach demonstrates that ideological reform under Ashoka was not purely symbolic but deeply integrated into the practical functioning of the empire, ensuring that moral directives were actionable, monitored, and enforceable. The transition toward Dhamma established a precedent for linking ethical principles with state administration. It allowed the Mauryan Empire to extend its authority across diverse regions, while maintaining centralized oversight and operational coherence. Provincial officials, military personnel, and urban administrators were all integrated into a governance system where ethical responsibilities were formalized alongside fiscal and logistical duties. This framework created a durable model for integrating ideology, administration, and social management, setting the stage for subsequent reforms in policy, communication, and civic oversight. In summary, Ashoka's early post-Kalinga reforms demonstrate the practical application of moral governance. Through inscriptions, provincial implementation, and systematic monitoring, the Mauryan state incorporated Dhamma into its administrative framework. Revenue collection, urban management, military coordination, and social welfare continued under ethical guidelines, creating a governance system that combined inherited institutional capacity with ideological innovation. The integration of moral principles into state operations reshaped the Mauryan administrative landscape, preparing the empire for the later consolidation of Ashoka's policies and the propagation of Dhamma throughout the subcontinent. The Maurya Empire governed not through charisma, but through paperwork. At its height, the state administered a population spread across diverse linguistic, cultural, and geographic zones. Central authority depended on a sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus capable of coordinating taxation, law enforcement, trade oversight, and military deployment. Evidence from the Arthashastra, corroborated by archaeological discoveries in Pataliputra and references in Mauryan inscriptions, indicates that the empire relied on a formalized and hierarchical system of governance to maintain control over its extensive territories. The core of the central administration was located at the imperial capital, Pataliputra. Excavations at the site reveal fortifications, administrative complexes, and evidence of systematic urban planning, including granaries, storage facilities, and road networks. These physical remains suggest a city designed not merely for habitation but for bureaucratic efficiency. The imperial court included ministers, treasurers, military commanders, judicial officers, and clerical staff, all operating within a clearly defined chain of authority. Each official had specific duties, ranging from revenue management and record-keeping to supervising provincial governors and coordinating military operations. Key ministerial roles included the Mahamatra or chief officer overseeing multiple aspects of governance. These officers were responsible for monitoring provincial compliance, reporting on local conditions, and enforcing imperial policies. Treasury officials supervised state finances, ensuring that revenue from land, trade, and monopolized industries flowed efficiently to the central administration. Military commanders maintained troop readiness, coordinated logistics, and oversaw the strategic placement of garrisons, particularly in frontier regions. The system relied on meticulous documentation to prevent inefficiency, fraud, or rebellion, reflecting a reliance on structured bureaucracy rather than personal authority alone. Provincial governors were an essential component of this hierarchy. While central officials established policy, governors administered day-to-day operations across the empire's regions. They collected taxes, supervised urban centers, and maintained law and order. The governors were accountable to the central administration through periodic reports and inspections, creating a feedback loop that integrated local conditions into imperial decision-making. Archaeological evidence of administrative buildings and urban fortifications in regional centers such as Taxila, Ujjain, and Tosali supports textual descriptions of a structured provincial system capable of executing centralized directives. The Arthashastra, although prescriptive, provides detailed insight into the operational expectations of the Mauryan bureaucracy. It outlines codified procedures for taxation, market regulation, espionage, and internal security. While the text may exaggerate certain mechanisms, its descriptions align with the logistical demands of governing an empire spanning over 1,000 kilometers from west to east and encompassing multiple ecological zones. The correspondence between prescribed procedures and the archaeological record indicates that the Mauryan state possessed the institutional capacity to implement complex administrative measures at scale. Record-keeping was a fundamental aspect of central administration. Detailed accounts of land ownership, taxation, trade transactions, and population registers were essential to maintain both fiscal stability and social control. Treasuries and archives were maintained at Pataliputra and provincial capitals, enabling the emperor and his ministers to monitor revenue, plan resource allocation, and detect discrepancies. The systematic use of written documentation illustrates the Mauryan reliance on formalized processes rather than informal enforcement or localized discretion alone. State monopolies constituted another instrument of centralized control. The empire regulated key economic activities, including mining, metallurgy, salt production, and trade in strategic commodities. Control over these sectors allowed the administration to direct resources toward military, infrastructural, and civic projects, ensuring that the central government maintained both economic leverage and fiscal stability. Provincial governors and treasury officials were responsible for enforcing these monopolies, integrating economic oversight into the broader bureaucratic network. Military administration was closely tied to central governance. Troops were stationed in strategic locations, both to protect provincial centers and to secure trade routes. Commanders reported to the central administration, coordinating logistics, troop movements, and supplies. The Mauryan military was organized into infantry, cavalry, and war elephants, all integrated into the bureaucratic chain of command. This combination of administrative oversight and military readiness reinforced the capacity of the state to enforce policy and maintain cohesion across its diverse territories. Judicial functions were also centralized. Imperial edicts and provincial officials enforced laws that regulated land disputes, commercial transactions, and criminal offenses. The bureaucratic apparatus ensured that legal rulings were consistent with central policy, and provincial reports enabled the emperor to monitor compliance. The integration of judicial oversight into the bureaucratic system reflects a systematic approach to governance, in which legal, fiscal, and military mechanisms were coordinated through a hierarchical administrative network. The reliance on documentation, standardized procedures, and hierarchical oversight demonstrates the Mauryan emphasis on systemic governance. Central authority was maintained not through personal charisma or coercive force alone, but through institutional mechanisms capable of transmitting policy across vast distances. By coordinating fiscal, military, and legal functions within a bureaucratic framework, the Maurya state could administer a population of millions and integrate culturally and geographically diverse regions into a coherent imperial system. By the conclusion of this phase, the central administration of the Mauryan Empire was a highly organized and structured system. Ministers, treasurers, military commanders, and provincial governors operated within an established hierarchy, using written records, inspections, and procedural oversight to maintain control. State monopolies, fiscal management, and legal enforcement were integrated into daily operations, illustrating the capacity of bureaucracy to sustain imperial authority over a vast and complex territory. This administrative centralization, in turn, required effective regional delegation to function, setting the stage for provincial oversight and the operation of Mauryan governance at local levels. Imperial reach depended on local compliance. The Mauryan Empire, encompassing diverse linguistic, cultural, and geographic regions, relied on provincial governance to implement centralized policies effectively. The empire was divided into large provinces, often termed janapadas or bhaktis, administered by royal princes or trusted officials appointed by the emperor. This structure allowed the central authority at Pataliputra to delegate day-to-day governance, while maintaining oversight of fiscal, military, and legal functions. Archaeological evidence and edict placement corroborate textual accounts of provincial administration. Pillar and rock edicts are distributed throughout the empire, from the northwestern frontiers in modern Afghanistan to the eastern coastal regions of Kalinga and the southern reaches of Telangana. Their strategic locations suggest coordination with provincial authorities, enabling imperial decrees to reach both urban centers and rural districts. Such distribution reflects the integration of local administration within a broader hierarchical framework that maintained central policy while accommodating regional conditions. Provincial governors held substantial authority within these territories, exercising oversight over taxation, military garrisons, urban management, and trade regulation. Governors were accountable to the emperor and central ministers, submitting reports on population, revenue, and security. While they enjoyed autonomy in daily decision-making, their actions were circumscribed by regular inspections, standardized procedures, and the threat of central intervention. Archaeological remains of fortified provincial capitals, administrative buildings, and urban infrastructure indicate that governors maintained control through both civic management and military presence. Beneath the provincial level, the administration was further subdivided into districts, towns, and villages. District officials, often drawn from local elites or appointed by the governor, were responsible for implementing imperial policies, collecting taxes, and maintaining public order. Village headmen supervised agrarian management, irrigation systems, and local dispute resolution, ensuring compliance with fiscal and legal frameworks. This layered governance allowed the Mauryan state to manage a population spread across vast and topographically diverse regions, from fertile river valleys to coastal plains and forested interiors. Taxation illustrates the balance between local autonomy and central oversight. Provincial and district officials collected land revenue, trade duties, and other levies, remitting a portion to the imperial treasury while retaining minimal administrative fees to support local functions. Written records, as described in the Arthashastra and corroborated by edict directives, ensured accountability. Periodic audits and inspections reinforced compliance, demonstrating that the delegation of authority operated within tightly controlled fiscal parameters. Military oversight was similarly structured. Provincial garrisons, commanded by appointed officers, maintained security, enforced law, and monitored trade routes. Troop movements and logistical support were coordinated with the central administration, ensuring that governors could respond to local disturbances without undermining imperial cohesion. Frontier regions, particularly in the northwest and along the eastern coast, were fortified and staffed with permanent contingents, reflecting the integration of provincial military authority within the centralized chain of command. Legal administration extended to local levels through district courts, town councils, and village assemblies. Officials enforced imperial laws concerning property, commerce, and criminal offenses, while mediating disputes in accordance with standardized procedures. This combination of legal authority and administrative delegation reinforced imperial legitimacy, ensuring that central policies were applied consistently across culturally and linguistically heterogeneous regions. The system also drew continuity from earlier Magadhan practices, which relied on provincial supervision and local intermediaries to implement policy across the Gangetic Plains. The balance between autonomy and oversight was central to Mauryan provincial governance. Governors and local officials exercised discretion in managing daily affairs, adapting imperial directives to regional contexts. At the same time, mechanisms of surveillance, inspection, and reporting maintained accountability. Edicts frequently instruct officials to monitor the welfare of populations, observe compliance with moral and fiscal policies, and report deviations to higher authorities. These measures ensured that local management did not compromise imperial objectives, illustrating the interplay between decentralization and centralized control. Economic integration was facilitated through the coordination of provincial administration. Governors oversaw market regulation, trade facilitation, and resource allocation, ensuring that local economies contributed to imperial revenue. State monopolies on critical commodities, such as metals, salt, and textiles, were enforced at the provincial level, while allowing for adaptation to local production and distribution systems. This approach enabled the Mauryan state to manage complex economic networks while accommodating regional variation, reinforcing both stability and fiscal efficiency. By the end of this administrative phase, provincial governance under the Mauryan Empire functioned as a structured and accountable system. Local authorities implemented policies, collected revenue, managed urban and rural infrastructure, and enforced law under the supervision of provincial governors and ultimately the central administration. The integration of local compliance with imperial oversight allowed the Mauryan state to extend authority across a vast and heterogeneous population, ensuring stability, cohesion, and economic productivity. This system of decentralized execution under centralized control created the operational backbone for the empire. Provincial and district officials translated high-level directives into actionable policies, while the central administration monitored performance through inspections, reports, and edicts. By combining local autonomy with rigorous oversight, the Mauryan state maintained effective governance across diverse regions, providing a model of imperial administration capable of managing both scale and complexity. Order was maintained through both law and observation. The Mauryan Empire combined formal legal institutions with systematic surveillance to ensure stability across its extensive territories. Central to this system was the administration of justice, which encompassed courts, legal procedures, punishments, and monitoring mechanisms designed to enforce compliance. Textual sources, particularly the Arthashastra, provide detailed prescriptive guidance on legal and intelligence structures, while Ashokan edicts demonstrate the practical application of justice and oversight in imperial governance. At the center of legal administration were courts at both the imperial and provincial levels. The emperor and central ministers retained ultimate judicial authority, particularly for cases involving high-ranking officials, fiscal disputes, and matters affecting imperial revenue. Provincial governors operated district courts and oversaw local adjudication. Village headmen and town councils conducted preliminary hearings and mediated disputes concerning land, trade, and civil offenses. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and urban planning patterns, indicates that administrative buildings often incorporated courtrooms or designated spaces for judicial proceedings, illustrating the integration of legal functions within the broader bureaucratic apparatus. Legal procedures emphasized both codified rules and oversight mechanisms. The Arthashastra outlines structured processes for evidence collection, witness testimony, and penalty determination. Punishments ranged from fines and labor obligations to corporal and capital sentences, calibrated according to offense severity and social status. These procedures were enforced within a hierarchical framework in which local and provincial officials reported their activities to central authorities, ensuring consistency and accountability. By systematizing law enforcement, the Mauryan state maintained social order while reinforcing the authority of the central administration. Surveillance played a complementary role in maintaining legal compliance and administrative efficiency. The Arthashastra describes networks of spies, informants, and intelligence officers tasked with monitoring officials, merchants, and populations. Provincial governors were responsible for implementing these systems, deploying observers to detect irregularities, corruption, and potential rebellion. Information collected was relayed to the central administration, enabling the emperor and his ministers to make informed decisions, address misconduct, and maintain control over distant regions. Archaeological evidence, such as fortified provincial centers and strategic outposts, supports the operational capacity for such observation. Ashokan edicts reflect a nuanced approach to law and surveillance. While acknowledging the need for social order, these inscriptions emphasize restraint, ethical governance, and welfare-oriented oversight. Rock Edict 13, for example, instructs officials to ensure justice, mediate disputes fairly, and consider the welfare of both human and animal populations. These directives illustrate a practical integration of moral principles into legal administration, showing that coercion was balanced with procedural oversight and public accountability. The edicts demonstrate that legal and surveillance mechanisms were not purely punitive but functioned as tools for governance and social cohesion. Provincial and district officials were essential to this system. They implemented judicial decisions, monitored compliance, and reported violations. Village headmen and town councils were responsible for enforcing minor regulations, supervising local markets, and ensuring adherence to imperial law. Regular inspections, reporting protocols, and the use of written documentation allowed the central administration to maintain awareness of conditions across the empire. This combination of localized execution with hierarchical oversight created a reliable framework for administering justice at multiple scales. The Mauryan legal system was closely linked to fiscal and economic administration. Land revenue collection, market regulation, and state monopolies required clear rules and enforcement mechanisms to function effectively. Courts adjudicated disputes over property, taxation, and trade, while surveillance networks ensured compliance with commercial regulations. By integrating judicial oversight with administrative and economic functions, the Mauryan state maintained both order and efficiency, using law as a practical instrument of governance rather than solely as a moral or coercive tool. Military and internal security considerations were also intertwined with legal administration. Surveillance networks monitored potential rebellions, disloyal officials, and frontier unrest. Reports enabled governors and central officials to preempt disturbances and coordinate military responses when necessary. The strategic placement of garrisons, combined with judicial and administrative oversight, ensured that the Mauryan state could enforce its laws and maintain territorial integrity without excessive reliance on reactive force. Public communication of legal norms was an integral aspect of enforcement. Edicts, inscriptions, and public proclamations disseminated rules, procedural expectations, and official directives to local populations. By providing clarity on legal responsibilities and the consequences of noncompliance, the state reinforced obedience and legitimacy. These measures also facilitated the integration of moral governance, as outlined in Ashoka's adoption of Dhamma, with conventional legal and bureaucratic enforcement structures. By the end of this phase, Mauryan law, justice, and surveillance mechanisms functioned as an interconnected system, balancing coercion, administrative oversight, and ethical governance. Courts, district officials, village headmen, and provincial governors operated within a hierarchical framework supported by intelligence networks and inspections. This combination of structured legal procedures and active observation ensured compliance with fiscal, administrative, and social obligations, reinforcing imperial authority across culturally and geographically diverse regions. The integration of judicial administration with surveillance, economic oversight, and provincial governance established a durable model of state control. Legal mechanisms were operationalized alongside bureaucratic and military structures, enabling the Mauryan Empire to maintain order over a vast territory. These systems also laid the foundation for Ashoka's later reforms, in which ethical governance through Dhamma supplemented the practical enforcement of law. Mauryan India was religiously plural long before it was unified. By the time Chandragupta and Bindusara consolidated power in the Gangetic Plains, the subcontinent already hosted a diverse array of religious traditions, practices, and philosophical systems. Brahmanical traditions, encompassing Vedic ritualism, sacrificial rites, and priestly hierarchies, were widely established, particularly in urban centers and agricultural regions of the Ganges Basin. These systems coexisted alongside heterodox movements, including Buddhism and Jainism, which emphasized asceticism, ethical conduct, and alternative approaches to cosmology and social organization. Archaeological evidence illustrates this pluralism. Excavations at sites such as Vaishali, Rajgir, and Sravasti reveal early Buddhist monastic complexes and stupas, while inscriptions and reliefs demonstrate patronage by regional elites. Jain communities are documented through textual references and the remnants of monastic structures in northern and western India. Local and tribal cults, often associated with fertility, river, and forest deities, continued to operate independently or in conjunction with more institutionalized systems. This multiplicity of religious forms highlights the complexity of spiritual life prior to Ashoka's ideological reforms. Brahmanical traditions retained significant social and ritual authority. Priests, Brahmins, performed sacrificial rites, oversaw domestic rituals, and served as intermediaries in the administration of religiously sanctioned law. These practices were reinforced by land grants, royal patronage, and urban support, creating networks of influence that extended into both the political and economic spheres. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence from Pataliputra and other regional capitals indicates that Brahmanical temples and ritual spaces were integrated into urban planning, reflecting the continued importance of these traditions in civic and administrative life. Buddhism, emerging from the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, had established monastic communities throughout the northern subcontinent by the Mauryan period. Monasteries and stupas functioned not only as centers of religious practice but also as hubs of education, social organization, and economic activity. Pilgrimage routes connected these sites, and patronage from regional rulers facilitated the construction and maintenance of religious infrastructure. Inscriptions from this period, though later in some cases, attest to the recognition of Buddhist institutions by ruling elites, reflecting an environment of tolerance and coexistence rather than state-imposed hierarchy. Jainism similarly maintained a network of monastic communities and ritual practices. The tradition emphasized nonviolence, ascetic discipline, and ethical conduct, paralleling certain Buddhist principles while remaining distinct in doctrine and organizational structure. Archaeological remains, including cave complexes and monastic cells in regions such as Bihar and Madhya Pradesh, demonstrate the existence of sustained Jain communities under varying degrees of political support. These structures indicate continuity with pre-Mauryan practices and adaptation to the administrative and economic frameworks of the empire. Local cults and indigenous religious practices remained widespread, particularly in peripheral and tribal regions. Rivers, forests, and hills were associated with protective and fertility deities, and communal rituals often reflected local ecological and social conditions. While less documented in central texts, these practices are evident in material culture, including small shrines, votive offerings, and figurines. The persistence of these traditions underscores the pragmatic approach of the Mauryan administration toward regional diversity, allowing local religious life to continue within the overarching framework of imperial governance. Evidence from Ashokan edicts suggests that state engagement with religion was primarily regulatory and supportive rather than coercive. Rock and pillar edicts reference multiple religious communities, encourage ethical conduct across sects, and promote tolerance. There is no indication that the Mauryan state imposed a single religious orthodoxy or subordinated civic authority to a particular faith. Instead, the administration recognized the functional and social roles of different religious groups, integrating their institutions into broader frameworks of education, welfare, and moral guidance. Religious diversity also intersected with cultural and economic life. Monastic institutions often managed land, organized local labor, and facilitated trade, while Brahmanical temples served as centers of ritual economy and civic organization. The Mauryan state's awareness of these roles enabled the integration of religious infrastructure into imperial administrative planning, including taxation, urban management, and the coordination of labor and resources. Religious institutions thus became partners in governance, mediating between central authority and local populations without undermining the autonomy of either party. By the conclusion of this period, the Mauryan religious landscape had been shaped by centuries of pluralistic development. Brahmanical, Buddhist, Jain, and local cultic traditions coexisted in a dynamic equilibrium, with overlapping networks of influence, patronage, and institutional function. The empire's administrative apparatus accommodated this diversity, relying on provincial and local officials to recognize and respect religious practice while maintaining fiscal and legal authority. This framework set the stage for Ashoka's later ideological initiatives, in which moral governance and promotion of Dhamma would be articulated within a culturally heterogeneous environment. Ashoka's policies and edicts did not emerge in a vacuum. They were implemented within this pluralistic context. The pre-existing coexistence of diverse religious communities provided both the opportunity and the necessity for the emperor to articulate a framework of governance that emphasized ethical conduct, social welfare, and religious tolerance. By understanding the religious landscape of the Mauryan Empire, scholars can appreciate how administrative, cultural, and ideological strategies were adapted to manage diversity, maintain cohesion, and legitimize imperial authority across the subcontinent. Dhamma was governance through conduct, not belief. Following the Kalinga campaign, Ashoka articulated a system of ethical and administrative guidance known as Dhamma, inscribed across rocks and pillars throughout the empire. These edicts emphasized social harmony, ethical behavior, and respect for life, functioning as a prescriptive framework for both officials and citizens. Importantly, Dhamma was not synonymous with Buddhism. While Ashoka identified with Buddhist principles, the edicts present Dhamma as a practical and inclusive moral code, designed to unify a heterogeneous population under a common set of behavioral and civic expectations. The content of Dhamma addressed multiple aspects of governance and social conduct. Central themes included nonviolence toward humans and animals, respect for elders and teachers, honesty in trade and administration, and equitable treatment of all subjects. Officials were instructed to disseminate these principles, mediate disputes, and monitor adherence, integrating moral guidance into the functioning of the imperial bureaucracy. These directives reflect an understanding of ethics as an instrument of governance, linking the moral behavior of both rulers and ruled to the stability and cohesion of the state. Ashokan edicts demonstrate regional adaptation in the communication of Dhamma. Inscriptions in Prakrit dominate the central and eastern regions, while Aramaic and Greek are used in western provinces bordering Hellenistic territories. Variations in phrasing and emphasis suggest sensitivity to local linguistic, cultural, and political contexts. For example, edicts in Western regions place greater emphasis on respect and cooperation with foreign populations, reflecting the multicultural composition of frontier territories. This multilingual dissemination illustrates the administrative sophistication of Ashoka's regime and the importance of tailored communication in implementing an empire-wide ethical framework. The institutionalization of Dhamma required both bureaucratic and local engagement. Provincial governors, district officials, and village headmen were tasked with communicating edict directives to their constituencies, monitoring compliance, and reporting deviations to higher authorities. These measures extended the reach of central authority while simultaneously fostering local responsibility. In this manner, ethical governance was not merely declarative. It was operationalized through administrative hierarchies, integrating moral guidance with existing bureaucratic, legal, and fiscal systems. Ashoka's concept of Dhamma also emphasized social harmony and conflict mitigation. The edicts encouraged tolerance among religious sects, mutual respect among communities, and adherence to lawful behavior. By promoting ethical conduct as a public good, Ashoka sought to reduce internal tensions, foster civic obedience, and legitimize imperial authority without coercion alone. This approach illustrates the functional dimension of Dhamma. It was designed to stabilize society, facilitate governance, and ensure the orderly interaction of diverse populations under a single imperial structure. The edicts also reflect attention to intergenerational and educational responsibilities. Officials were instructed to promote moral education, respect for teachers, and proper treatment of children. These prescriptions indicate that Dhamma extended beyond immediate administrative concerns, shaping social norms and daily behavior in a manner intended to reinforce long-term cohesion. The emphasis on ethical instruction complements Ashoka's directives on justice, surveillance, and welfare, demonstrating the integration of moral, civic, and administrative objectives. Evidence from edict placement suggests strategic planning in disseminating Dhamma. Pillars, rocks, and urban installations were selected to maximize visibility and accessibility. Prominent locations such as trade routes, city entrances, and assembly spaces ensured that the message reached officials, merchants, and the general populace. Multilingual inscriptions further expanded reach, allowing Dhamma to be understood across the linguistic diversity of the Mauryan territories. This combination of spatial and linguistic strategy highlights the practical orientation of Ashoka's moral framework as a governance tool rather than a purely religious or philosophical statement. Ashoka's approach to Dhamma did not entail coercive conversion. The edicts repeatedly emphasize voluntary adherence, persuasion, and instruction, rather than enforced belief. Officials and citizens were encouraged to adopt ethical behaviors as part of civic participation and social responsibility. This distinction underscores that Dhamma functioned as a unifying framework of conduct, promoting stability and compliance across a multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire without subordinating local traditions or imposing a single religious orthodoxy. In addition to promoting ethical behavior, Dhamma provided a conceptual basis for integration with other state functions. Provincial governors and local officials incorporated its principles into judicial oversight, fiscal administration, and public works. Reports on compliance with Dhamma were transmitted to the imperial center, allowing the emperor and his ministers to assess social stability and the effectiveness of local governance. By embedding moral conduct into operational processes, Ashoka created a feedback system linking ethical behavior, administrative performance, and imperial legitimacy. By the conclusion of this period, Dhamma had emerged as a comprehensive framework for moral political governance. It integrated ethical instruction, social oversight, legal compliance, and administrative reporting into a coherent model suitable for a vast, culturally diverse empire. The articulation of Dhamma reflects a sophisticated understanding of how moral principles can function as practical instruments for social cohesion, governance, and legitimacy. Its deployment across linguistic, regional, and institutional contexts demonstrates both the conceptual depth and the operational precision of Ashoka's vision. Ashoka's promotion of Dhamma established a precedent for ethical governance in South Asia, showing that imperial authority could be exercised through conduct and instruction rather than coercion or doctrinal imposition. The conceptual and practical dimensions of Dhamma provided a unifying moral framework adaptable to local circumstances while maintaining coherence at the imperial level. This ethical political doctrine, communicated systematically across provinces and integrated into administrative processes, set the stage for the subsequent development of cultural and institutional policies under Ashoka's reign. The empire spoke through stone. Ashoka's edicts, inscribed on rocks and pillars across the subcontinent, represent a deliberate strategy of moral and administrative communication. These inscriptions functioned not as mere proclamations, but as instruments for conveying ethical principles, legal norms, and imperial directives to officials, local communities, and travelers. Their distribution, language choices, and placement were calibrated to integrate diverse regions into a cohesive administrative and moral framework. Geographic placement of inscriptions was strategic. Pillars were erected in urban centers, along trade routes, and near religious sites, ensuring high visibility to populations engaged in civic, commercial, and ritual activities. Rock edicts were installed in natural landscapes, accessible to travelers and regional inhabitants, thereby extending the reach of imperial directives into rural and frontier areas. Archaeological surveys indicate that edicts were concentrated in regions such as Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and the Deccan, while Western provinces utilized Greek and Aramaic inscriptions to address Hellenistic populations. This spatial distribution reflects an understanding of geography as a medium for governance, ensuring that moral and administrative messages reached both central and peripheral audiences. Language selection further demonstrates administrative sophistication. Most inscriptions are in Prakrit, the lingua franca of the Gangetic Plains, facilitating comprehension among local populations. In Western provinces, Greek and Aramaic were used, demonstrating sensitivity to linguistic diversity and the presence of foreign communities. Minor variations in vocabulary and phrasing accommodated regional norms and cultural expectations, while the core principles of Dhamma, nonviolence, respect, and civic duty remained consistent. This multilingual approach underscores the Mauryan administration's awareness that effective governance required not only content but also accessible communication tailored to the audience. The content of the inscriptions reinforces their administrative purpose. Pillars and rocks articulate directives concerning ethical behavior, social harmony, and the treatment of officials and subjects. They instruct governors, district officials, and village headmen to promote adherence to Dhamma, monitor local compliance, and report deviations. In some cases, edicts address the general populace, encouraging nonviolence, honesty in trade, and respect for elders and teachers. By embedding moral instruction within administrative practice, the inscriptions functioned as both educational tools and regulatory instruments, standardizing behavior across culturally diverse regions. Material and design choices of the pillars also reflect their administrative role. Many pillars were monolithic, finely polished, and engraved with uniform scripts, demonstrating a high degree of technical and organizational capability. Capitals, often carved with lions or other motifs, signified imperial authority, visually reinforcing the connection between ethical guidance and the emperor's office. Rock edicts, though simpler, were prominently inscribed in durable stone, ensuring long-term legibility and permanence. The combination of artistry, durability, and strategic placement illustrates that these monuments were intended as enduring instruments of governance rather than ephemeral messages. The integration of inscriptions into provincial administration extended beyond the central heartland. Governors and local officials were expected to communicate edict content, enforce directives, and adapt guidance to local conditions. Reports on adherence were relayed to the Imperial Center, providing a mechanism for feedback and monitoring. This integration ensured that moral and administrative principles were not abstract proclamations but operationalized through a chain of authority, reinforcing cohesion and consistency across distant territories. Edict content also addressed social plurality. Multiple religious and cultural communities are acknowledged, and the promotion of tolerance is emphasized. These messages were practical, guiding officials on equitable treatment and conflict mitigation. By embedding instructions for cross-community respect, the inscriptions facilitated social integration and reduced friction within an empire spanning linguistic, ethnic, and religious boundaries. This approach reflects a calculated strategy of soft governance, complementing legal, fiscal, and military oversight with ethical direction. Economic considerations were intertwined with this communication strategy. The visibility of edicts in trade centers, marketplaces, and major roads ensured that merchants, artisans, and other economic actors were aware of the moral and legal expectations associated with commerce. Instructions regarding honesty, fair dealing, and adherence to tax obligations supported the functioning of markets and the enforcement of state monopolies. By combining ethical guidance with practical governance, the inscriptions contributed to both social cohesion and economic stability. Evidence of maintenance and continuity suggests that this system was institutionalized. Some pillars bear multiple inscriptions over time, indicating that officials periodically reinforced or updated directives. The persistence of these monuments across centuries demonstrates that moral communication was an enduring component of imperial administration, integrated with fiscal, military, and legal mechanisms. Archaeological surveys show that these edicts were not isolated projects but part of a systematic strategy to standardize imperial authority across a vast territory. By the end of this period, Ashoka's inscriptions had established a pervasive mechanism of moral and administrative communication. Their geographic spread, Multilingual presentation and integration with local and provincial governance allowed Dhamma to reach both officials and populations effectively. These monuments functioned as both ethical instruction and practical oversight, providing a tangible link between the emperor, his administration, and the governed. In this way, Ashoka's moral and political vision was materially inscribed into the landscape of the empire. The use of stone and rock as mediums for communication underscores the durability and authority of imperial messaging. Through careful placement, linguistic adaptation, and consistent content, the Mauryan administration created a network of permanent markers articulating ethical, legal, and civic norms. By doing so, the empire transformed physical geography into a tool of governance, embedding its values and directives across urban, rural, and frontier landscapes. These policies, operationalized through inscriptions, pillars, and edicts, relied on the empire's economic and administrative capacity. The production, transportation, and engraving of stone required resources, skilled labor, and coordinated logistics, demonstrating the material underpinnings of ideological governance. The inscriptions thus illustrate not only Ashoka's ethical and administrative strategy, but also the economic and organizational infrastructure necessary to sustain such communication on an imperial scale. By linking ethical instruction to durable, visible monuments and integrating them into bureaucratic and provincial systems, Ashoka's administration established a model of governance in which moral and practical authority were mutually reinforcing. These measures reinforced social cohesion, standardized conduct, and projected imperial presence across the subcontinent. The pillars and rock edicts, as enduring instruments of policy and ideology, exemplify the Mauryan approach to unifying diverse populations through communication, administration, and ethical governance. Empire rested on fields, not fortresses. Agriculture formed the economic backbone of the Mauryan state, providing the resources necessary to sustain administration, military forces, and urban centers. The fertile Gangetic plains were intensively cultivated, with irrigation networks, plow-based agriculture, and crop rotation enabling consistent surpluses. Archaeological surveys reveal evidence of canals, reservoirs, and embankments designed to regulate water flow and mitigate seasonal variability, suggesting a coordinated approach to agrarian management at both local and provincial levels. Land assessment and revenue extraction were central to the state's economic organization. Textual sources, including the Arthashastra, describe systematic measurement of land, categorization of soil fertility, and calculation of expected yields. Taxes were typically assessed as a proportion of production, with rates adjusted according to crop type, soil quality, and climatic conditions. This system allowed the central administration to forecast revenue, plan for storage in state granaries, and distribute resources to provincial centers. Archaeological evidence from granary sites in Pataliputra and regional capitals supports these descriptions, indicating storage and redistribution on a scale commensurate with imperial administration. Provincial officials oversaw the collection and transport of agrarian surplus. Governors and district officers ensured compliance with taxation policies, maintained records of landholdings, and coordinated the movement of grain to urban centers and military garrisons. Village headmen acted as intermediaries between cultivators and the state, supervising labor obligations, recording yields, and reporting discrepancies. This hierarchical structure allowed the Mauryan state to integrate local agricultural production into a broader economic system while maintaining accountability and oversight. State granaries functioned both as storage facilities and instruments of administrative control. Grain reserves could be mobilized in times of famine, military campaign, or infrastructure projects, demonstrating the dual role of agricultural surplus in sustaining both population welfare and imperial operations. Excavations at sites such as Kumar in Pataliputra reveal large-scale storage complexes, including walled enclosures and compartmentalized structures, reflecting careful planning and standardized construction techniques. These granaries illustrate the material basis for the state's capacity to mobilize resources efficiently. Taxation systems were enforced through both bureaucratic oversight and local compliance. Officials conducted regular inspections of fields, monitored planting and harvesting schedules, and maintained registers of cultivators. The Arthashastra outlines the use of auditors and inspectors to prevent underreporting or evasion, emphasizing accountability and surveillance. Compliance was incentivized through legal and moral mechanisms, including punishments for evasion and recognition of adherence to state directives. The combination of local supervision and central oversight ensured that agricultural production could reliably support the empire's needs. Irrigation infrastructure was critical to maximizing agrarian output. Canals, tanks, and reservoirs regulated riverine and monsoon water, stabilizing yields in regions prone to seasonal variability. Archaeological and hydrological studies indicate that large-scale irrigation projects were coordinated at provincial levels, requiring mobilization of labor and resources. These systems enhanced productivity, supported population growth, and facilitated the concentration of surplus necessary for taxation, trade, and state-sponsored projects. Agriculture also interacted with other economic sectors. Surpluses supported urban centers, enabling the growth of markets, artisanal production, and administrative complexes. Grain facilitated the provisioning of military garrisons and the operation of bureaucratic institutions. By securing a predictable and transportable surplus, the Mauryan state could integrate agrarian, military, and administrative systems, reinforcing imperial cohesion and resilience. Land ownership patterns were regulated to support taxation and production. Private cultivators, communal holdings, and state lands coexisted, with the state maintaining authority over revenue collection and distribution of resources. Land grants to Brahmins, religious institutions, and officials were recorded in inscriptions, reflecting the integration of fiscal policy with social and religious structures. These arrangements illustrate the dual role of agriculture as both an economic and administrative instrument. By the end of this phase, the Mauryan agrarian economy functioned as a structured and controlled system capable of supporting the demands of a vast empire. Centralized assessment, local supervision, storage infrastructure, and irrigation networks enabled the state to extract and manage surplus efficiently. Agricultural production underpinned military campaigns, administrative expansion, urban growth, and the promotion of cultural initiatives, demonstrating the foundational role of agrarian resources in sustaining imperial power. The efficiency and reach of this system created conditions for further economic integration. Surplus extraction enabled trade, market development, and the financing of infrastructure such as roads, canals, and urban complexes. By linking production, taxation, and distribution, the Mauryan administration transformed agriculture into a predictable and controllable foundation for the empire. This integration of agrarian management, fiscal oversight, and infrastructural support exemplifies the systemic sophistication of Mauryan economic governance. Through coordinated agricultural planning, standardized taxation, and administrative oversight, the Mauryan state secured the material basis for imperial authority. Fields, granaries, and irrigation networks functioned as instruments of governance, sustaining both the population and the bureaucratic machinery. By controlling the flow of surplus and ensuring compliance, the empire reinforced cohesion across its provinces, linking local production to imperial objectives. This agrarian foundation not only supported immediate governance but also facilitated long-term stability and expansion, enabling the Mauryan state to operate on a scale unprecedented in South Asian history. Markets connected distant provinces more reliably than armies. The Mauryan Empire relied on a dense network of internal trade routes and urban centers to circulate goods, sustain economic activity, and reinforce administrative cohesion. Urban hubs such as Pataliputra, Taxila, Ujjain, and Vidisha functioned as nodes in a complex web of commerce, linking agrarian production to artisanal output and facilitating the redistribution of surplus. Archaeological excavations reveal organized marketplaces, standardized warehouses, and craft quarters, indicating a high degree of urban planning integrated with economic regulation. Coinage played a central role in these commercial networks. Punch-marked silver and copper coins, used throughout the empire, standardized transactions and facilitated long-distance trade. The coins bear simple geometric symbols, enabling recognition across linguistic and regional boundaries. Numismatic studies suggest that coin circulation was closely monitored, with minting authorities located in major urban centers and provincial towns. The presence of coin hoards at excavation sites confirms both widespread use and the accumulation of wealth in urban and semi-urban contexts. Market regulation ensured reliability and fairness in commercial activity. Local and provincial officials monitored weights, measures, and the quality of traded goods, often issuing standard measures for grain, textiles, and metals. Guilds of merchants and artisans operated under imperial oversight, providing a layer of self-regulation while maintaining accountability to the state. Inscriptions reference the coordination of guild activities, the settlement of disputes, and adherence to standardized practices, demonstrating the integration of local economic structures into broader imperial administration. Urban centers functioned as both commercial and administrative nodes. Pataliputra, the imperial capital, coordinated the flow of goods, managed state granaries, and served as the seat of bureaucratic authority. Taxila, situated on the northwestern frontier, acted as a hub for trade with Hellenistic territories, facilitating the movement of luxury goods, metals, and raw materials. Smaller towns connected surrounding villages to these urban cores, enabling regional markets to interface with imperial networks. Archaeological evidence, including street grids, marketplaces, and storage facilities, illustrates the organization and scale of these economic hubs. Trade networks were supported by infrastructure developed under imperial direction. Roads, river routes, and bridges facilitated the movement of goods and personnel, linking agricultural regions to urban markets. The Mauryan administration maintained and monitored these transport networks, ensuring security, reliability, and efficiency. These logistical systems amplified the economic impact of local production and enabled surplus to be mobilized rapidly for administrative, military, or cultural purposes. Guilds and professional associations played a pivotal role in regulating production and commerce. Artisans, metalworkers, and traders organized into structured groups, managing labor, quality, and market distribution. Imperial oversight ensured that these guilds adhered to standards for weights, measures, and transaction practices. Inscriptions reference specific guild activities and coordination with provincial authorities, indicating the integration of organized economic activity into the administrative framework. Guild participation also facilitated dispute resolution and compliance with taxation, reinforcing both economic stability and state oversight. Internal trade stimulated urban growth and economic diversification. Artisanal production, specialized crafts, and the circulation of goods generated employment and fostered interregional connectivity. Urban centers became hubs of political, cultural, and religious activity, linking economic function to broader governance. The concentration of population and wealth in cities allowed for the maintenance of state infrastructure, including administration, granaries, and public works, demonstrating the reciprocal relationship between trade and governance. By the end of this phase, the Mauryan internal economy had achieved a level of integration unprecedented in South Asia. Coinage, market regulation, guild organization, and urban planning collectively facilitated the circulation of goods, information, and labor across the empire. Economic activity was structured to support imperial administration, military provisioning, and urbanization, reinforcing cohesion and stability. Internal trade networks, operationalized through both formal and local mechanisms, served as a binding force across linguistically and culturally diverse provinces. The integration of commerce into the administrative framework ensured that trade was not merely a private enterprise but a pillar of imperial infrastructure. Surplus from agriculture and artisanal production could be mobilized, redistributed, and monitored, supporting the operational needs of the empire. Standardized coinage, market oversight, and guild coordination allowed transactions to occur efficiently and predictably, reinforcing confidence in both the economy and the state. These internal trade systems laid the foundation for external commerce. By establishing reliable markets, transport networks, and regulatory mechanisms, the Mauryan administration created conditions favorable for engagement with neighboring polities and distant regions. Trade routes originating in urban centers connected the subcontinent to the northwest, linking the empire to Hellenistic states, Central Asia, and beyond. The economic integration of internal and external trade facilitated the flow of goods, ideas, and diplomatic contact, demonstrating that the Mauryan economy was both internally cohesive and outward-looking. Through systematic organization of markets, coinage, and urban infrastructure, the Mauryan Empire achieved a level of economic coordination that reinforced political authority, urban development, and social integration. Internal trade not only connected producers to consumers, but also linked regional economies to imperial priorities, ensuring that wealth, labor, and resources supported both governance and expansion. By embedding economic activity within administrative structures, the empire transformed markets into instruments of cohesion, demonstrating that commerce could serve as a stabilizing and unifying force across a vast and diverse territory. The Maurya Empire was economically global before it was culturally so. By the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, long-distance trade connected the subcontinent to the Hellenistic world, Central Asia, and maritime networks across the Indian Ocean. Archaeological evidence, numismatic data, and Greek accounts indicate that Mauryan commerce was both extensive and systematically organized, facilitating the exchange of raw materials, luxury goods, and standardized currency across vast distances. Trade with Hellenistic territories in the West, including the Seleucid domains, was an important dimension of Mauryan foreign exchange. Greek sources such as Megasthenes Indica, Diodorus Siculus, and Strabo describe the export of Indian commodities, cotton textiles, ivory, spices, and semi-precious stones, to Central Asia and the Mediterranean. Archaeological finds, including Greek coins and amphory fragments in northwestern India, corroborate these accounts, demonstrating the presence of sustained commercial activity and cultural contact along overland routes and river systems. Central Asian connections were facilitated through passes such as the Khyber and Bolan, linking the subcontinent to Bactria, Sogdiana, and beyond. Mauryan merchants, often organized in guilds, traded metals, horses, textiles, and other commodities with Central Asian partners. Archaeological excavations in Taxila and Pushkalavati reveal storage facilities, trade inscriptions, and imported artifacts, indicating a structured and recurring exchange. These interactions not only supplied the empire with goods, but also strengthened diplomatic and political relations, demonstrating the interdependence of commerce and statecraft. Maritime trade extended Mauryan economic influence across the Indian Ocean rim. Ports on the western coast, including Badajoz and Sapphira, facilitated exports of spices, aromatic resins, and luxury items to the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, while eastern ports connected to Southeast Asia. Archaeological evidence of imported Mediterranean and Persian ceramics, along with semi-precious stones from India discovered in distant ports, illustrates the volume and reach of maritime networks. Maritime commerce required coordination of local administration, port authorities, and merchant guilds to ensure security, standardization, and timely delivery of goods. Coinage and standardized measures played a central role in long-distance exchange. Punch-marked silver coins and other forms of currency enabled transactions across linguistic and cultural boundaries, facilitating trade with foreign merchants. Numismatic evidence indicates that currency circulated not only within the empire but also beyond its borders, providing a medium of value and trust in markets spanning hundreds of miles. Standardization of weights and measures, described in texts and confirmed by archaeological finds, further facilitated reliable commercial interactions with both internal and foreign actors. Long-distance trade also stimulated the development of logistical infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and riverine transport supported the movement of goods from production centers to urban ports and markets. Caravanserais, storage facilities, and checkpoints along key routes facilitated safe and efficient commerce. The Mauryan state invested in these systems both to maximize economic output and to ensure that revenues from trade could be collected and integrated into imperial accounts. The coordination of infrastructure, administration, and commercial activity illustrates the systematic nature of long-distance economic integration. Trade networks fostered cultural and technological exchange as well. Interaction with Hellenistic states introduced new artistic motifs, metallurgical techniques, and urban planning concepts, while Central Asian and maritime contacts facilitated the diffusion of crops, crafts, and organizational practices. These exchanges were mediated through merchants, officials, and local intermediaries, showing how economic networks functioned as conduits for both material and intellectual exchange without requiring direct conquest or political subordination. Greek accounts also emphasize the scale of Mauryan production and wealth. Megasthenes describes large urban markets, standardized production, and the availability of luxury goods, suggesting a sophisticated integration of agricultural surplus, artisanal output, and long-distance commerce. Archaeological evidence, including urban planning, warehouses, and port facilities, aligns with these textual descriptions, providing material confirmation of the empire's participation in international trade. By the conclusion of this period, Mauryan long-distance trade had become a systematic and multi-regional enterprise. Connections with Hellenistic kingdoms, Central Asia, and the Indian Ocean Rim facilitated the flow of goods, capital, and information, integrating the empire into broader economic networks. The state played an active role in monitoring, regulating, and facilitating these exchanges, ensuring that trade reinforced both fiscal capacity and political stability. These commercial networks also had strategic implications. Economic integration enabled the provisioning of military forces, supplying garrisons with food, equipment, and material for construction. The logistical capability required for sustaining trade mirrored the organization needed to maintain imperial control over distant provinces. By linking economic activity to administrative and military systems, the Mauryan state demonstrated that commerce and governance were mutually reinforcing, allowing long-distance trade to support both fiscal strength and political authority. Through the coordination of trade, coinage, infrastructure, and administration, the Mauryan Empire achieved a level of economic sophistication that supported internal stability, external engagement, and imperial expansion. The integration of long-distance networks into the broader economic and administrative framework illustrates how the empire leveraged surplus, markets, and logistical capacity to maintain cohesion across diverse regions. These systems ensured that Mauryan India was not only internally interconnected but also positioned within a wider web of transregional exchange, underscoring the strategic importance of commerce as a pillar of imperial power. Military power was institutional, not personal. The Mauryan Empire relied on a professional standing army to secure its extensive territory, maintain internal stability, and project authority across diverse regions. Greek accounts, particularly those of Megasthenes, provide contemporary descriptions of the army's composition, scale, and organization, corroborated by Indian textual sources such as the Arthashastra. These sources emphasize that the army was structured around well-defined units, hierarchies, and administrative systems rather than individual leadership or charisma. The composition of the Mauryan military included infantry, cavalry, war elephants, and chariot contingents, each serving distinct operational roles. Infantry formed the backbone of the army, tasked with garrison duties, defensive operations, and participation in large-scale campaigns. Cavalry units provided mobility and reconnaissance, enabling rapid response to frontier threats. War elephants, drawn from the Ganges Plains and eastern regions, functioned as shock troops and as symbols of imperial power, while chariots, though declining in battlefield dominance, served ceremonial and logistical purposes. Greek observers noted the extensive use of elephants, highlighting their impact on both tactical deployment and psychological influence. Logistics and supply organization were integral to military effectiveness. The Mauryan administration coordinated the provisioning of food, arms, and equipment across the empire, utilizing state granaries, transport networks, and local resource contributions. Soldiers were stationed in garrisons distributed throughout strategic locations, including frontier forts, trade hubs, and key river crossings. Provincial governors oversaw these garrisons, ensuring both readiness and accountability. This integration of military and administrative structures allowed rapid mobilization while maintaining a permanent defensive presence. Command structures were hierarchical and professionalized. Officers were appointed based on experience, loyalty, and administrative competence. Corps were subdivided into manageable units with defined roles, facilitating coordination and control during campaigns. The Arthashastra details the appointment of commanders, recruitment standards, and the maintenance of discipline, reflecting a systematic approach to military administration. Greek accounts corroborate the existence of organized and disciplined units capable of operating at scale, indicating that the Mauryan military was comparable in sophistication to contemporary Hellenistic armies. Training and discipline were reinforced through institutional measures. Soldiers underwent periodic drills, were familiarized with equipment and tactical formations, and were subject to regulations governing conduct, accountability, and loyalty. Military service was linked to administrative oversight, with local officials monitoring garrisons and reporting to the central command. These measures ensured that military capacity was maintained as a state resource, integrated into both fiscal and governance systems, rather than dependent on temporary levies or mercenary contingents. Strategic deployment emphasized the protection of frontiers and critical infrastructure. Garrisons were positioned along trade routes, river crossings, and mountain passes, serving both defensive and administrative purposes. Mobile forces could respond to incursions, rebellions, or local disturbances, while permanent installations reinforced imperial authority. This distribution of forces allowed the Mauryan state to manage internal security and external threats simultaneously, reflecting a balance between centralized command and regional operational autonomy. Military logistics extended to the support of campaigns and extended operations. Supply chains, transport networks, and resource allocation were coordinated to sustain large-scale troop movements. The empire leveraged its agrarian base, urban centers, and granaries to provision soldiers, demonstrating the interdependence of economic and military systems. Campaigns, including Ashoka's conquest of Kalinga, illustrate the capacity of the army to operate effectively over extended distances, integrating manpower, material, and administrative coordination. By the end of this phase, the Mauryan standing army had become a professional and institutionalized instrument of imperial authority. Its composition, logistical organization, and hierarchical command structures enabled sustained operations, frontier defense, and internal stability. Military power functioned as an extension of the state apparatus, supported by administrative oversight, fiscal resources, and infrastructural networks. This institutionalization contrasts with armies dependent on temporary levies or personal retinues, demonstrating the systemic nature of Mauryan military capability. The professional army reinforced imperial integration by linking military, administrative, and economic systems. Garrisons and supply networks connected distant provinces to central authority, while disciplined forces ensured compliance with legal and fiscal policies. The army's operational capacity also enabled the projection of power into frontier regions, facilitating diplomacy, trade security, and territorial expansion. In this sense, military organization was both a tool of defense and a mechanism for sustaining cohesion across a multi-ethnic and geographically diverse empire. Through structured composition, logistical planning, and integration with provincial administration, the Mauryan standing army exemplifies the empire's approach to statecraft. Military capacity was neither ad hoc nor purely symbolic. It was embedded within the broader administrative framework, coordinated with economic resources, and sustained through permanent institutions. By institutionalizing military power, the Mauryan Empire ensured that authority could be exercised consistently, that borders could be defended, and that the state's objectives, political, economic, and cultural, could be realized across a vast and complex territory. Diplomacy preserved what war had gained. The Mauryan Empire maintained its territorial and political reach not solely through military force, but through carefully calibrated diplomatic engagement with neighboring states and frontier regions. From the northwestern Hellenistic domains to the southern kingdoms of the subcontinent and the Himalayan peripheries, Ashokan and Chandraguptan administrations utilized embassies, marriage alliances, and political negotiation to stabilize borders and secure imperial objectives. Relations with the Seleucid Empire exemplify Mauryan diplomatic strategy. Following Chandragupta's campaign against Seleucus I Nicator, the Treaty of 303 to 302 BCE formalized territorial arrangements and established a marriage alliance, consolidating gains in the northwestern provinces. Greek sources, including Megasthenes, describe the exchange of gifts and the recognition of political authority, reflecting a reciprocal approach to diplomacy that combines strategic concession with assertion of imperial interests. This framework enabled the Mauryas to integrate frontier territories without protracted conflict, ensuring both political stability and access to trade routes. Southern diplomacy involved engagement with regional polities such as the Tamil kingdoms, the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas. Though military expansion into the deep south was limited, inscriptions indicate tribute arrangements, trade agreements, and envoys exchanged to maintain peaceful relations. By balancing projection of power with negotiation, the Mauryan administration avoided unnecessary conflict, while asserting influence over economically and strategically important southern regions. Archaeological evidence of coin circulation and trade artifacts corroborates the integration of these polities into imperial economic networks. The Himalayan and trans-Himalayan frontiers presented unique challenges. Mountain passes and river valleys connected the subcontinent to Central Asia and Tibet, requiring both military vigilance and diplomatic engagement with local tribes. Envoys facilitated negotiations, secured supply lines, and established protocols for transit through contested territories. These diplomatic measures complemented garrison forces stationed along key routes, creating a layered approach to frontier management that combined coercion with negotiation. Marriage alliances functioned as instruments of diplomacy and political legitimation. Interdynastic marriages between Mauryan rulers and peripheral elites fostered loyalty, reduced the likelihood of rebellion, and created symbolic bonds reinforcing imperial authority. Such alliances were complemented by gifts, ceremonial recognition, and formal embassies, which communicated both respect and hierarchical position. Inscriptions and textual references indicate that these arrangements were carefully monitored and recorded, illustrating the administrative integration of diplomacy into statecraft. Embassies served multiple functions beyond political negotiation. They facilitated intelligence gathering, monitored frontier developments, and mediated disputes among local polities. Greek and Buddhist sources note the presence of Mauryan envoys at foreign courts, transmitting messages of peace, asserting imperial prestige, and fostering trade relations. These missions exemplify a strategic use of soft power, complementing military capacity and reducing the need for armed intervention. Frontier management also relied on administrative coordination within the empire. Provincial governors oversaw diplomatic interactions in their regions, maintained communication with central authorities, and ensured that treaties and arrangements were implemented. This combination of centralized oversight and local initiative allowed the Mauryan state to respond flexibly to changing circumstances, maintaining stability across diverse and geographically dispersed borders. By the conclusion of this period, Mauryan diplomacy had achieved a balance between coercion and negotiation. Military victories established territorial boundaries, but it was through embassies, alliances, and frontier administration that these gains were preserved and consolidated. Diplomacy functioned as an instrument of statecraft, reinforcing military capacity, stabilizing regions, and enabling trade and cultural exchange across borders. The integration of diplomatic practices with frontier garrisons, trade networks, and administrative oversight illustrates the systemic sophistication of Mauryan external relations. By combining negotiation, strategic alliance, and controlled military presence, the empire maintained cohesion, mitigated conflict, and projected authority without overextension. This approach highlights the complementary relationship between coercive and cooperative instruments in sustaining imperial stability. Before we conclude, if you found this exploration of the Mauryan Empire informative, consider subscribing to Nightfall History and clicking the bell icon. This ensures you receive daily deep dives into the civilizations, empires, and historical legacies that shaped our world. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Mauryan governance or Ashoka's policies did you find most striking? Your engagement helps support continued research-driven history content.